Chapter 29-23. These Luo fans' bodies were formed from the laws of the dimension. Not only were their bodies incomparably tough, but they could also create and give birth to all the power they wanted at any time and recover all the damage they suffered. They could also make use of the resonance between themselves and the dimension and the corresponding plane to absorb everything they needed from the dimension and other planes. Under such circumstances, as long as it wasn't destroyed and erased at the first moment, it was almost certain that it would recover. Therefore, at this time, although most of the figures had already suffered serious injuries when they passed through the phantoms, all their injuries quickly recovered with the help of various factors. Faced with such a situation, the plane attributes of the world's will in the dimensions began to panic. Without the protection of the phantoms, the plane attributes had already lost their final trump card. They were no longer concealed and directly appeared in front of the Luo fans' figures in the dimensions. At such a time, Luo fan didn't have the mood to talk nonsense at all. With just a thought, the figures in the dimensions began to take action. One by one, they began to attack the plane attributes of the world's will incarnations in the dimensions. In most of the dimensions, the Luo fans could only injure the plane attributes and couldn't get rid of them in a short period of time. However, in a few dimensions, the plane attributes couldn't resist at all and were easily dealt with by the Luo fans' figures in the dimensions. The reason for this was naturally because the plane attributes were the plane attributes of the world's will incarnations. Just what kind of unfathomable existence was this great world's world will? This was something that had been said many, many times before. Such a world's will couldn't be ordinary even if it was only the plane attributes. At the very least, it was impossible for all the plane attributes to be ordinary. The vast majority of the plane attributes were far superior to the plane attributes of ordinary objects. These were the plane attributes that had the ability to resist the Luo fans' figures in the dimensions. Of course, the vast majority was only the vast majority. In the end, it wasn't everything. After all, the world's will couldn't really extend its means to all planes, so it couldn't be as easy as Luo fan to control the plane attributes corresponding to itself. Therefore, even though the power it simulated had unimaginable characteristics and could affect many planes in a mysterious way to protect its plane attributes, it couldn't be perfect after all. In the end, it couldn't be perfect and leave no flaws. The plane attributes corresponding to those flaws were obviously the focus of Luo fan's attack. This was also the plane attributes that Luo fan could easily destroy in those dimensions. The destruction of a plane attribute did not only affect the corresponding plane. Every plane attribute was closely related to the entire plane. Every plane attribute was closely related to the entire plane. In the real world, the destruction of any layer of attributes would bring about the destruction of the entire entity. This was just like the many vital organs in a living being's body. For living beings, the organs in their bodies were indeed only a part of their bodies and could not be equated with their lives. This was like the many vital organs in a living being's body. To a living being, the organs were only a part of its body and couldn't be equated with its life. For everything in the real world, the attributes of the plane were equivalent to their vital organs. If any one of them was destroyed, it would lead to the complete destruction of the entire plane, of course. Although the vital organs were used as an analogy, the organs and plane attributes of a living being were still fundamentally different. At the very least, although some of the organs of a living being were important, they weren't closely related to its life. For example, the skin and the cecum, however, the plane attributes were different. Every single one of the plane attributes was an indispensable part of things in the real plane. In other words, to anything in the real plane, the plane attributes were its vital organs. From this aspect, if anything were to be looked at from the plane attributes, it would obviously have too many vital organs. This might be a little unreasonable, but it was the truth. In order to directly target the plane attributes, one must have incredible abilities and unimaginable knowledge. To obtain such abilities and knowledge was obviously countless times more difficult than identifying the location of a living being's vital organs and the method to destroy them. It was only natural that he could gain so much from such a difficult task and grasp so many weaknesses. At this moment, the countless plane attributes in front of Luo Fan started to collapse on their own. And at the same time as these plane attributes collapsed, the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth that existed in the whole of the real plane also collapsed. At this moment, the huge vortex seemed to have lost its ability to restrain itself. Everything that formed the vortex dissipated in all directions and turned into smoke that gradually melted into the surrounding void. It either disappeared without a trace or turned into all sorts of strange or ordinary things in the sea below. In an instant, the sea seemed to have been reopened. All sorts of islands were born, all sorts of living beings were born, and all sorts of strange things were born out of thin air. It seemed very mysterious and strange. In the beginning, Luo Fan was extremely satisfied. He was all smiles as he looked at the changes in the vortex in front of him. However, as time passed, he gradually felt that something was wrong. The speed at which the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth dissipated was simply too fast. At the very least, it was more than 10 times faster than what he had originally expected. The incarnation of the will of heaven and earth dissipated and collapsed because some of its plane attributes were destroyed. With Luo Fan's understanding of planes and his familiarity with the attributes of planes, he was clearly aware of the consequences of the collapse of certain planes' attributes, how fast they would dissipate, and how fast they would collapse. Thus, even if his guess about the speed at which the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth collapsed differed from reality, it would at most be a difference of 1 or 2 times. Any more than that, and it would be a sign that there were changes that he did not understand. And now, the speed at which the incarnation of the will dissipated was more than 10 times faster than what he had expected. This situation did not seem right no matter how he looked at it. No matter how he looked at it, there seemed to be some changes that he did not understand appearing in the will of heaven and earth. After discovering this, Luo Fan did not dare to hesitate. He released the many-dimensional splitting techniques that he had already restrained and strengthened them even further. They began to continuously spread into the interior of the incarnation of the will that was collapsing. At this moment, the dimensional splitting technique was almost unobstructed as it probed into the interior of the incarnation of the will. The incarnation of the will that was collapsing clearly did not have any defensive capabilities, and it was completely helpless against the dimensional splitting technique. The dimensional splitting technique continued to penetrate deeper and deeper, and it continuously approached the core of the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth. Originally, the countless dimensions were enough to completely envelop the incarnation of the will. Previously, when he destroyed the plane attributes of the incarnation of the will, he had clearly done the same. However, at this moment, he vaguely realized that the deeper his dimensional splitting technique went, the weaker it seemed to be at the core. Is it because of the chaos? Such a guess flashed across Luo Fan's mind. However, he quickly rejected this possibility. Even if it was chaos, it was not enough to cause such an outcome. After all, although chaos itself had countless possibilities, it could not change the plane. At this moment, the plane attributes of the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth had clearly completely collapsed. Everything that made up the incarnation of the will had clearly lost its complete nature. Under such circumstances, even if it was chaos, it would at most affect a certain level of attributes or a certain dimension. It would never be able to slow down the division of any dimension. There's something inside. After figuring this out, Luo Fan instantly made a judgment in his heart. Since he had already made a judgment, there was no need to say more about what he should do next. Since there was something inside, he naturally had to find it. With a slight thought, he exerted a little more force on the dimensional splitting technique. Many similar but fundamentally different versions of Luo Fan appeared in the various dimensions at the same time. After these Luo Fan appeared, they each released various kinds of power that ordinary cultivators dared not even think about, directly sweeping away the various discrete plane attributes that belonged to the vortex in those dimensions. If the vortex was still intact in the past, these plane attributes would naturally have the overall power to protect it, and it would not be easy to destroy it at all. However, now that it had completely collapsed, the vortex itself could even be considered to have ceased to exist. Under such circumstances, there was naturally no overall power to protect it, and the various plane attributes naturally did not have any protection. There was no need to say what would happen to Luo Fan, who was materialized in different dimensions, if he were to face the Luo Fan, who had appeared in different dimensions. There was no need to say more. In just an instant, the world became clear. The power that was originally constantly collapsing, disintegrating into the void, merging into the ocean, or stirring the laws of the vortex had completely disappeared at this moment, as if it had never appeared. Evidently, due to the destruction of practically all the layers of the vortex, not even a single trace of it remained. Although this vortex was much smaller than the original incarnation of the world's will, its size was still calculated in light years. After completely wiping out this large vortex, the things that remained were extremely inconspicuous in comparison. In this inconspicuous state, even Luo Fan took a while to discover the marvelous object that existed in the center of the vortex after the collapse of the vortex. It was a small vortex. It was only a few hundred feet in radius, and it looked many times more solid than the previous vortex. The power that belonged to the incarnation of the world's will was also many times denser. In fact, it could even be said that apart from the appearance of the vortex, there seemed to be nothing else related to the world's will. At this moment, although Luo Fan did not know what it was, he knew very well that he could not sit back and watch it develop naturally. Immediately, he took action without any hesitation. In a flash, he had already traversed through space and appeared in front of the vortex. Then, he raised his hand and covered the void of the vortex. At the same time, countless dimensions slammed into the vortex. However, not even the slightest ripple emerged from the numerous dimensions this time. These dimensions were unable to invade the vortex at all. The vortex existed there as if it did not have any plane attribute. It was everything without any concealment, and it could not be divided in any form. Pure and unique. At this moment, these words suddenly appeared in Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, only these 4 words could describe this vortex. It could even be said that only the current vortex could truly be called these words. Apart from this vortex, any other existence that Luo Fan had used these words to describe in the past was not worthy of these words at all. Faced with the fact that his dimensional division had lost its effect, Luo Fan did not give up. On the one hand, he increased the number of passageways that he could communicate with the various planes, and on the other hand, he began to communicate with his other incarnation. On the other hand, he began to communicate with his other incarnation. It was the incarnation of the 3-legged cauldron that was condensed from the power related to the true sage. Endless suppressive power quickly traversed space and time as he communicated with it. Following his thoughts, it fiercely suppressed the vortex that was dozens of feet in radius in front of him. As the suppressive power descended, everything in the surroundings seemed to have frozen in an instant. Even if it was space-time, the various dimensions, the passageways of the various planes, and the power of the various planes, everything that was going on stopped at this moment. Chapter 29-24. Under this suppressive force, the small vortex that was several meters wide seemed to freeze slightly. However, this stagnation was quickly broken. In the next instant, the vortex suddenly started to shrink rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it turned into the appearance of a middle-aged man. He replaced the existence of the vortex and appeared at the center of the suppressive force. This middle-aged man seemed to be in his 40s. He looked calm and composed, as if he was in control of everything in the universe. At this moment, after appearing in front of Luo Fan, he smiled and looked at Luo Fan with eyes that seemed to glow. At this moment, the figures of Luo Fan that existed in the countless dimensions collapsed one by one, as if they were under some kind of indescribable pressure. As the figures of Luo Fan collapsed and disappeared, the dimensions that had been separated also gradually started to shake and distort at the same time. In the next instant, all the dimensions collapsed, and the surroundings returned to normal in the real world, as if nothing had happened. It was just that without the pure vortex, there was this extremely extraordinary-looking middle-aged man in front of him. The suppressive force was still acting on the middle-aged man, but the middle-aged man seemed to completely ignore it. At this moment, even though he was bathed in the suppressive force, his expression did not change at all. He only looked at Luo Fan quietly. "Have you been devoured by the power?" Luo Fan asked. "Devoured? No. It's just that I obtained a power clone like you," the middle-aged man said with a faint smile. "Power clone? This doesn't look like a power clone at all. Power clones should be closely connected to one's main body. Do you still have any connection with your main body?" Luo Fan asked. This middle-aged man had a human form. In other words, he had the appearance of the born Taoism aptitude that Luo Fan knew, and he looked exactly like him. However, this was only the form and the essence of the body. The specific appearance, figure, and many other details were completely different from his. It was clear that the middle-aged man had constructed his body out of thin air using the appearance of the born Taoism aptitude that Luo Fan knew, and not Luo Fan's appearance. There was a prerequisite for constructing a body based on what Luo Fan knew of the born Taoism aptitude. That was, he had to first agree with Luo Fan's understanding of the born Taoism aptitude. In other words, he had to agree with part of Luo Fan's worldview, even if it was only a part of it that was related to the connate Taoism aptitude. If this middle-aged man was the main body of a living creature, it would naturally not be a big deal. Agreeing with a certain concept about the born Taoism aptitude was not actually a distortion of one's self. In other words, if this middle-aged man was in his original form, there would be no possibility of him being devoured by the power. Unfortunately, this middle-aged man was not his real body. He was merely the incarnation of the will of the world. As the embodiment of the will of the world, its relationship with the main body was clearly that of a subsidiary. There was no problem with the main body changing and the incarnation changing. However, if the main body did not change, but the incarnation changed, then there was a problem. This was especially so when it came to the change in the choice of concept. The main body of the middle-aged man, the will of the world, was still in the form of a vortex. It still did not acknowledge any form as the born Taoism aptitude, but the incarnation in front of him had acknowledged a certain form as the born Taoism aptitude. Therefore, it was obvious that there was a difference between the main body and the incarnation. This difference could not have appeared without a reason. No matter how he thought about it, it seemed that the power that was simulated was the source of the difference. It was because of this consideration that Luo Fan felt that the incarnation of the will of the world in front of him had actually been devoured by that power. At the very least, it had been distorted by it. Perhaps. The middle-aged man had no intention of explaining to Luo Fan at all. At this moment, his body swayed, and his figure had already appeared in front of Luo Fan. He raised his hand and slapped at Luo Fan. There was no reaction from his surroundings at all. It was as if his action was just the most ordinary and casual action of an ordinary person. However, it was this slap that made Luo Fan feel an incredible pressure. It was as if he was enduring the pressure of the universe at this moment. The palm seemed to have filled the world, permeating all space-time, all dimensions, and all planes. Faced with such an attack, how could Luo Fan dare to be careless? At this moment, a series of concept magic erupted from his body and turned into a world of magic. He threw it out with one hand, and it met the palm of the middle-aged man in front of him. At Luo Fan's level, space-time could almost be played with at will. At this moment, even if the world of magic was boundless under Luo Fan's will, it was only the size of a fist on the surface. It was not much different from the palm that the middle-aged man in front of him had sent out. When the two collided, an endless shockwave was released from the collision. Along with this shockwave, there were also endless rumbles, endless power, and even endless matter. However, all of this was in an invisible form that was continuously transmitted in all directions along with the shockwave. As for the surrounding space-time and the surrounding laws, they were completely shattered in an instant and turned into nothingness. Moreover, the nothingness and chaos were still spreading wildly as the shock waves continued to spread. In the blink of an eye, a boundless void appeared around them. Outside this void, at the edge, endless things were being formed. Among these things that were being formed, there was energy, matter, space-time, karma, fate, rules, laws, and so on. Everything that could be found in a normal world could be found there. However, most of these things that were being formed were extremely chaotic. Not to mention forming a world, it was extremely difficult to pick out a small part of them. Only a very small number of areas would show order and even the appearance of space-time due to the various complicated changes. However, everything was quickly destroyed by the shock waves. They disappeared and turned into nothingness once again, causing the area of nothingness to expand even further. In the normal space-time outside, countless things were being formed again, and they quickly disappeared. Just like that, the cycle continued and continued to advance in all directions. This process seemed extremely long, but in reality, for Luo Fan and the middle-aged man, it had already been a very long time since they started fighting. In that instant, the speed at which they attacked each other was extremely fast. In just the blink of an eye, they had already exchanged tens of thousands of moves. For Luo Fan, his dimension separation could not split the other party, nor could he turn the other party into countless layers of attribute. His suppressive power could not suppress the other party either. This made it impossible for him to get rid of the other party as easily as he had when he faced the incarnation of the world's will. In this way, he could only choose to use all sorts of abilities, concepts, powers to fight the other party, just like how he had fought in the past. Fortunately, his dimensional division technique and suppressive force were not completely useless. Although it seemed like he could not directly target the other party and get rid of the other party easily. But in reality, it was precisely because of these two things that the middle-aged man could not unleash his techniques recklessly. He seemed to not care about the dimension separation and the suppressive power at all, as if he had completely disregarded them. However, it was obvious that this was only what it looked like. In reality, during this process, he had to expend a lot of energy and a lot of mental energy to maintain the dimension separation around him and resist the powerful suppressive power at all times. Because of this huge consumption, he could not truly display his advantages and directly get rid of Luo Fan's incarnation. After all, if it was really as he had displayed, completely disregarding the dimension separation and the suppressive power, it was clearly close to the power related to a true saint. With such a special characteristic, how could it be possible for it to be entangled with Luo Fan's incarnation for such a long time? In every breath, they exchanged tens of thousands of moves. All sorts of wonderful divine abilities and techniques that could make ordinary people feel like their worldview had been subverted were being displayed between them at every moment. The commotion that they caused also continued to spread in all directions. The void that had been swept out when the dimension separation and the palm came into contact for the first time was already filled with concentric circles. These concentric circles were naturally the various movements that occurred during the process of their battle. They were either fluctuations, power, light, sound waves, matter, spacetime, nomological laws, rules, or even the fluctuations of the great Tao. They could be said to have everything. These concentric circles continued to spread in all directions as they continued to exchange blows, following the fluctuations of the object that had appeared in the beginning and frantically spreading outwards. Very soon, he had already crossed a distance of who knows how many billions of light-years, and crashed into the chaos that covered an area of who knows how many billions of light-years at the core of the world. The moment the shock wave came into contact with the chaos, boundless chaos suddenly erupted and instantly engulfed the outermost shock wave. In the blink of an eye, it had already followed the trajectory of the shock wave and directly wrapped around the countless concentric circles in the center like a huge circle. In the center of this concentric circle, Luo Fan and the middle-aged man were also present. At this moment, both Luo Fan and the middle-aged man seemed to have sensed something. To them, the shock wave produced by the collision of their own power was like an extension of their own power. It must be known that they were not ordinary cultivators or even ordinary people. For ordinary cultivators or even ordinary people, the shock wave caused by the collision of their power was the shock wave that had already been released. It had nothing to do with them at all. However, for existences at the level of Luo Fan and the others, no matter how long they had been separated from their own power, they would not sever their connection with it. Unless there was a stronger power or a higher existence that severed this connection, the shock wave produced after their collision was naturally the same. From a certain point of view, these shock waves could even be regarded as another battlefield that they had opened up. It also carried the purpose of their battle, and they were also trying their best to suppress their opponents and get rid of them. Under such circumstances, how could they possibly lose their perception of these shock waves? Therefore, at this moment, the moment these shock waves were engulfed by the chaos, Luo Fan and the middle-aged man instantly sensed it. Looks like we can't continue fighting anymore. At this moment, both Luo Fan and the middle-aged man instantly confirmed this point. The chaos had already formed a circle in all directions, directly surrounding the area where Luo Fan and the middle-aged man were. Although there was still an extremely great distance between them, it was almost inevitable that they would be able to cross this distance. If they did not pay attention to it, very soon, this area that spanned hundreds of millions of light-years would also turn into endless chaos, and it would also become like the chaotic state at the core of the world. At that time, if they wanted to break through and escape, it wouldn't be as easy as it was now. With a slight thought, the two of them confirmed each other's thoughts. At this moment, they did not continue fighting, and they did not even have the intention to try their last move. They instantly separated. As they separated, the concentric circles that had been continuously generated around their bodies instantly stopped. The surrounding void became wider and wider. In the blink of an eye, their surroundings had become completely silent. There was no longer any sound or movement. Chapter 29-25. It was obvious that if the two of them did not pay attention to the situation, the chaos would eventually drown them again. It was not a good feeling to be drowned by the chaos. Even if it was Luo Fan, if he wanted to avoid this kind of chaotic damage, he would need to use many methods to do so. It might not be a big deal under normal circumstances, but in a battle, especially when he was facing the middle-aged man, it would be even more dangerous. Because of this, Luo Fan did not want to fall into the chaos again. Although the middle-aged man did not know how strong his resistance against the chaos was, it was obvious that he had not reached a state where he could completely ignore it. Once he fell into the chaos, he might only need to exert a little bit of strength to avoid the erosion and influence of the chaos. Or he might need to expend a lot of strength to resist the erosion and influence of the chaos. Obviously, with Luo Fan watching from the side, the middle-aged man was not willing to fall into such an awkward situation. Luo Fan was extremely wary of the middle-aged man, and the middle-aged man was obviously not indifferent to Luo Fan either, because both of them had the same thought: when they discovered that the chaos was rapidly approaching them, both of them stopped at the same time. In that instant, both of them knew what the other was thinking without looking at each other. Suddenly, the same thought appeared in both of their minds at the same time. Maybe I should choose to make a move now. The middle-aged man's choice showed that the chaos had a considerable impact on him. Perhaps the impact he received was not as serious as the middle-aged man's. If that was the case, making a move would obviously be advantageous to him. Both of them thought so, but in the end they gave up on this idea. It was just a possibility. Perhaps the impact he received was not as serious as the middle-aged man's, but perhaps it was just the middle-aged man's mistake in judgment. Or perhaps the truth was the other way around. Obviously, the outcome was unpredictable. For such an unpredictable result, Luo Fan was naturally repulsed. As for the middle-aged man, he was also against it. Hence, since they had already stopped, there was naturally no need for them to continue fighting. After all, apart from the chaos, there were simply too many places for them to make a move. The vast and boundless world was a stage for them to take action. Since there were so many places to take action, why did they have to fight to the death in a place where the consequences were unpredictable? However, although the two of them did not continue to fight, it was obvious that they would not start working together. The chaos outside was just a little troublesome for them, but it wasn't enough to make them feel troubled. At this moment, Luo Fan and the middle-aged man disappeared from the center with a flash. When they reappeared, they were at the two ends of the void. When the two of them were connected, it just so happened that the diameter of the void passed through the core. This was obviously the furthest distance they could get from each other. At this moment, after arriving at these two locations, the two of them began to take action. In reality, the two of them seemed to have completely disappeared in an instant. Needless to say, Luo Fan enveloped himself with countless dimensions and divided himself so that he completely disappeared from the main body of reality. On the other hand, the middle-aged man directly constructed a space-time to envelop himself. In the end, he used supreme power to forcibly strengthen the connection between the normal space-time and the space-time he had created. After paying a huge price, he directly penetrated the connection and disappeared from the space-time, as well as the void. At the same time, Luo Fan's figure also directly entered the chaos along with the other multiple dimensions. Although the chaos was extremely powerful and even the middle-aged man, who was a derivative of the world's will, was unwilling to touch it. However, in reality, at least at this moment, its width was not much at all. As long as one could withstand the corrosion of the chaos, it would not be difficult to cross its width. At least, for Luo Fan, it was not a difficult thing to do. Very soon, Luo Fan, who was enveloped and divided by the dimensions, had already withstood the endless chaos and the infinite corrosive and devouring power. He directly rushed out of the chaos and appeared in the normal space-time of the outside world. After arriving here, the dimension separation disappeared instantly. His figure also disappeared. When he reappeared, he was already hundreds of millions of light years away. At the moment when he disappeared, the area where he appeared instantly collapsed and everything was erased in an instant. Even the void seemed to have ceased to exist. After a while, the middle-aged man appeared outside the area and looked at the place where everything had been erased regretfully. Obviously, the middle-aged man was the one who had attacked just now. Although Luo Fan and the middle-aged man had also escaped from the void and the chaotic wrapping, it was clear that the middle-aged man had consumed more energy in an instant, and his power was greater, but his speed was faster. After all, he had only crossed space-time and had not moved in the normal space at all. Such a process could be completed in an instant as long as a sufficient price was paid. Obviously, the middle-aged man had completed it in an instant. In this way there was a result. That was, when Luo Fan rushed out of the chaos, the middle-aged man had been waiting outside for a long time. Under such circumstances, unless the middle-aged man was a fool, How could he not see if there was a chance to sneak an attack on Luo Fan? Obviously, the middle-aged man was not a fool. However, what was more obvious was that although Luo Fan's speed was slower, he had consumed less power. He did not need to recover at all to take other actions. In this way, when he got out of the chaos, he directly activated his technique and consumed a large amount of power to directly cross spacetime and leave his original position. He appeared here hundreds of millions of light years away from the place where trouble had arisen. The middle-aged man's regret was obvious. He had clearly done his best, but he still could not get rid of his opponent. How could he not feel regret? Although it was hundreds of millions of light years away, this distance was not much of an obstacle for existences at Luo Fan's level. At this moment, the middle-aged man had already discovered Luo Fan's position. As for Luo Fan, he also noticed the middle-aged man's previous actions. The two of them were separated by hundreds of millions of light years. When their gazes met, it was as if they were face to face. The distance of 1 year of walking was 1 light year. Normally, it would take hundreds of millions of years for their gazes to meet over a distance of hundreds of millions of light years. However, it was obvious that this was only the situation in the normal spacetime and the normal universe. Or rather, it was only the situation in the universe after Earth was broken. In a more advanced world, in a more brilliant universe, the speed of light was not as fixed as that of the broken Earth, or as slow as that of the universe after the Earth. Just the huge difference in the speed of light was enough to make the distance of hundreds of millions of light years no longer an obstacle to one's line of sight. Furthermore, the ones looking at them were Luo Fan, an existence who was going through the seventh tribulation, and the middle-aged man, who was a derivative of the will of the world. Given their level, how could the things they wanted to see be limited by distance? With all these conveniences, even hundreds of millions of light years would not be an obstacle to them looking at each other. At this moment, the middle-aged man did not continue to attack Luo Fan. After looking at Luo Fan for a while, he turned around and left. His figure instantly disappeared from Luo Fan's senses, as if he had never appeared. There seemed to be a subtle vibration in the sky, as if some sort of change had occurred in the sky. It seems like his greatest enemy is not me. At this moment, Luo Fan realized something. The middle-aged man's strength was actually much stronger than his current incarnation. If his incarnation had not had the powerful support of his main body and another incarnation, he would have been completely eliminated when he had started fighting with the middle-aged man. Under such circumstances, it was absolutely difficult for him to detect the middle-aged man within a short period of time if the middle-aged man wanted to hide. Therefore, he had completely lost track of the middle-aged man. If the middle-aged man had simply wanted to guard against him, there was no need for him to do this. Although the battle between Luo Fan and the middle-aged man seemed to be exchanging blows, the truth was that the middle-aged man had the upper hand. All along, only those who were at a disadvantage would flee in panic. Those who did not have the upper hand would instead avoid their enemies, as if they were avoiding the plague. Therefore, it was obvious that the middle-aged man had displayed his concealment ability to such an extent. It was obvious that his real target was not Luo Fan. Since his target was not Luo Fan, there was no need to say what he was after. The changes in the sky became more and more obvious, and there were even faint muffled sounds that lingered. The laws of this world, at least within a range of billions of light years, were undergoing all sorts of indescribable changes. It was as if some sort of indescribable probing law was being formed. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan was even more convinced of his guess. As expected, it's the matter between the main body and the incarnation. At that moment, he could only sigh to himself. At this moment, he could not be bothered to stay there any longer. He turned around and headed back to where his main body was. He suddenly suspected that what the middle-aged man had wanted to do to him was not to erase him, but to make some kind of subtle change to him. Perhaps the purpose of the change was to allow him to gain independence and freedom? At the thought of this, the incarnation did not know what to think. Perhaps after being distorted and gaining independence and freedom, he would be extremely grateful to the middle-aged man. However, it was obvious that he was still Luo Fan's incarnation at this moment, and there was still no enmity between him and Luo Fan. The thoughts of such an incarnation were Luo Fan's thoughts, and his self-awareness was Luo Fan's self-awareness. In this way, it was naturally impossible for the middle-aged man to have any good impressions of him, who wanted him to gain independence and a part of him to break away from him. "It's really annoying," as he muttered. Luo Fan disappeared from this area. Time slowly flowed. Unknowingly, another few thousand years had passed in this world. During these thousands of years, at the edge of the area where Luo Fan's main body was, there were endless battles. The living beings in the spacetime created by Luo Fan and the living beings in the spacetime created by the will of the world outside fought for the goal of destroying each other. Of course, compared to those living beings, perhaps it would be more accurate to describe this kind of battle as a war. Over the past thousands of years, hundreds of millions of living beings had perished in this war at almost every moment. The seawater at the border had already turned a little red because of this death. Due to the faint red color, the ocean was filled with a lot of vitality. The blood of living beings was the source of vitality. When blood was splashed and blended into the seawater, it would naturally increase the vitality in the seawater, allowing all kinds of living beings that had not yet met the conditions to be born because of this vitality. Among them, some living beings had even reached a level where their blood could transform. Just the blood of such living beings was enough to naturally give birth to many races. The result of such blood being splashed was needless to say. It could be said that billions of lives were dying in this battle at every moment. Fortunately, the area that had broken free from the shackles was wide enough, and the border was long enough. Otherwise, endless baleful qi and resentment would have covered the sky and earth a long time ago. Of course, even if the border was long enough, it could not completely avoid the influence. Chapter 29-26. One day, Luo Fan suddenly felt that among the many spacetimes at the boundary, there was a strange change happening to some spacetimes. The enmity between those spacetimes and the opposite heaven and earth seemed to have disappeared without a trace. They almost turned a blind eye to the flaws revealed by the opposite spacetimes. Even the attacks from those spacetimes were powerless, as if they were just putting up a perfunctory front. This situation only happened to one or two spacetimes, so it was naturally not a big deal. After all, different spacetimes had different styles and naturally made different choices. Who knew if something had happened to that spacetime, or if there had been a change in its leader, or if it had simply been damaged because of some messy incident? There were countless reasons for that spacetime to change like this. However, that was only the case for one or two spacetimes. Now, the spacetimes that had changed were counted in millions. Millions of spacetimes had suddenly changed in sync. No matter how one looked at it, this situation could not be just a coincidence. There must be some kind of crucial change that had appeared in these spacetimes. What happened? Luo Fan was secretly curious. In his heart, he faintly felt that this might have something to do with the middle-aged man who was the embodiment of the world's will. After all, in this part of the world, apart from Luo Fan, it seemed that only the middle-aged man could break free from the control of the world's will. Under such circumstances, the existence that had broken free from the control of the world's will was very likely to be the middle-aged man who was once the embodiment of the world's will. Of course, this was only a baseless guess at the moment. As for the specifics, it would naturally depend on the subsequent investigation. Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. In the relative spacetime of those spacetimes, relative changes would naturally begin to occur. All kinds of experts began to be pushed by some kind of inexplicable force, and they began to doubt what was happening in the opposite spacetimes. With this suspicion, they began to take action. They used all kinds of methods to investigate all the changes that might have occurred in the opposite spacetimes in this situation. From another perspective, it was just that the fighting style between the spacetimes had changed from the original head-on to a completely opposite form. Of course, most of it was the spacetimes under Luo Fan's control seeping into the spacetimes created by the world, or rather, the spacetimes created by the world's will. If it was just one or two spacetimes, it would not be easy and simple to get the answer. However, if there were more spacetime, the situation would be completely different. With more spacetime, the power to detect spacetime at the same time would naturally increase. As the power of spacetime detection increased, the feedback of information that could be obtained at the same time naturally began to increase. The detection feedback from one or two pieces of spacetime was only a partial harvest, but when the feedback from multiple pieces of spacetime was combined, they could barely piece together a complete outline. The heavenly Tao has changed. Luo Fan had a rough idea of why those spacetimes had changed after integrating the feedback from millions of pieces of spacetime. The heavenly laws of time and space were clearly different from before. It was as if some kind of external power was seizing control of the empty heavenly Tao. This kind of seizure had not yet been completed, but it had caused a certain amount of chaos. In the end, the behavior of those spacetimes had changed, causing their hatred towards their corresponding spacetimes to disappear without a trace. These are just the spacetime that shows the disappearance of the hatred. It's not all the spacetimes that the heavenly Tao is changing. After understanding this, Luo Fan realized that the spacetimes that were changing now were definitely not just the spacetimes that he had detected. These spacetimes just happened to be the spacetimes that showed the disappearance of the hatred towards their corresponding spacetimes due to the chaos of the heavenly Tao. It was very likely that they were just a very, very small part of the countless spacetimes where the heavenly Tao was in chaos. Among the unknown trillions of spacetimes on the boundary, there might be more, perhaps tens of billions, hundreds of billions, or even trillions of spacetimes where the heavenly Tao was changing at the same time, causing chaos. However, because those changes and the chaos were even more obscure and impossible to detect, Luo Fan did not pick them out from the unknown trillions of spacetimes at this time. With this thought in mind, he began to more carefully observe the unknown trillions of spacetimes on the boundary, and began to look for the changes in those spacetimes that he had overlooked before. Soon, he found many clues that had changed. A large number of spacetimes that might cause the heavenly Tao to be in chaos were locked by him. There were hundreds of millions of these spacetimes alone. And this was only the slightly obvious changes in spacetimes that could be discovered with just a little more concentration. Apart from such spacetimes, there were still more spacetimes that were ambiguous and seemed to have changed, but also seemed to have changed due to some kind of choice. In such a spacetime, even if only half of the spacetimes were chaotic, the number of them was still in the trillions. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan had a faint look of doubt on his face. In his heart, he had more or less confirmed that the source of the chaos was really the middle-aged man who was once the incarnation of the will of the world. However, what exactly did the middle-aged man want to achieve? Why did he attack these spacetimes? This was something he had no idea at all. At this time, in those spacetimes, the chaos of the heavenly Tao began to quickly calm down. In some spacetimes, external forces had won. In some spacetimes, the original heavenly Tao had won. The heavenly Tao, which was won by external forces, was directly distorted into a different appearance. It looked completely different from the original. In contrast, the spacetimes that were originally won by the heavenly Tao did not completely return to their original appearance because of this. Compared to the original spacetimes, their performance was much worse. The spacetimes that were won by external forces had enough external forces to eliminate all the chaos caused by the previous chaos of the heavenly Tao. In the end, the spacetimes quickly returned to their normal appearance, causing all kinds of strange things to quickly disappear, and order was re-established. The spacetimes that were originally won by the heavenly Tao were different. They did not have any other forces involved, and if they wanted to achieve any of their goals, they needed to rely on the power of their own spacetimes and their own power. Under such circumstances, if they wanted to restore the spacetimes, they would obviously be a step slower. Because they had lost order and guidance, their performance was even worse than when the heavenly Tao was in chaos. Instead, they were constantly being defeated in the battle against the opposite spacetimes, causing the situation of the war to quickly shift in the direction of their enemies gaining the upper hand. The goal of the spacetimes that were won by external forces after their change was only to protect themselves, and they did not succumb to it. On the contrary, the spacetimes within the boundary did not take the initiative to launch any malicious actions against the spacetimes. It was as if they wanted to stay out of the matter. With more spacetimes like this, the situation of the entire boundary changed in an instant. Unknowingly, the boundary began to gradually push outwards, causing the areas that had escaped the shackles of the world's will to unknowingly expand. This situation made a faint smile appear on Luofan's face. Although I don't know what your goal is, it is clear that our goals coincide. He muttered. With a slight thought, the movement of the spacetimes that he had created on the boundary began to change. He began to ignore the spacetimes that had obviously retracted their claws and teeth, and the spacetimes that were originally baring their fangs and brandishing their claws to hide and protect themselves. As for the spacetimes that clearly wanted to continue their previous enmity, but their standards were greatly reduced, and they seemed to have become more and more chaotic, he began to constantly oppress them. Under such a selective change of action, the boundary line began to change rapidly. The originally rather round boundary began to become uneven, and from its original round appearance, it turned into an irregular shape. The battle between spacetimes was originally an extremely simple battle between two spacetimes. However, as time passed, as this kind of battle carried out again and again, as both sides invested more and more power in this battle, and as more and more lives were invested in this battle, the region in the middle of the opposing spacetimes was gradually contaminated with the essence of the two spacetimes. The region becoming full of vitality was the greatest proof of this change. If it wasn't because of the interweaving and merging of the essence of the inside and outside, how could the region, as a battlefield, produce so much vitality? Don't forget, the vast spacetime outside the boundary was originally an area with no vitality at all, and the essence of these two spacetimes clearly represented the different essence of the region within the boundary and the region outside the boundary. In other words, the essence of the region that had escaped the shackles of the world's will and the region that had not escaped the shackles of the world's will. In this way, the victory and defeat of the two spacetimes would naturally be unknowingly linked to the nature of the battlefield. If the spacetime outside the boundary won, then the battlefield would naturally turn into an area that was locked by the shackles of the world's will. In other words, it would be an area that had lost all vitality and hope. And if the spacetime within the boundary won, the situation would be reversed. The region of the battlefield would naturally turn into an area that had escaped the shackles of the world's will. It was precisely because of this that the boundary would constantly change position with the victory and defeat of the spacetime. And this situation actually didn't appear naturally. In fact, the reason why this situation appeared was because Luo Fan and the world's will had consciously facilitated it. In the beginning, both sides had a tacit understanding to facilitate this outcome. Otherwise, what would be the point of this space-time battle on the boundary? Could it be just for the fun? At this moment, facing such an advantage, Luo Fan revealed a faint smile and began to connect the various spacetimes, causing the power of many spacetimes to flow continuously. The spacetime power that faced external forces that controlled the spacetime began to converge towards the spacetime corresponding to the spacetime within the boundary where the heavenly Tao had won and began to continuously attack that spacetime. Along with this change, the victories that the space-time within the boundary won began to increase. After all, the fact that these spacetimes could reach a stalemate with each other meant that the strength of both sides was roughly equal. Since their strengths were roughly equal, then adding more strength from one side would naturally give the other side an absolute advantage. And at this moment, this advantage could obviously be easily turned into victory. The spacetime outside the boundary was gradually defeated. In the end, it even had to shift spacetime, causing the spacetime to retreat continuously. In the end, each of them retreated hundreds of millions of light-years away before they could finally avoid the pursuit of the spacetime. In front of him, where the original battlefield was, or rather, where the original spacetime was, the boundary between the inside and outside had been pushed forward. The spacetime within the boundary had also taken a big step forward. It wasn't that the spacetime within the boundary didn't want to advance further, but because the battlefield in front was no longer the original battlefield. Without the fusion of the inside and outside essence, it was naturally impossible to advance further. If they wanted to advance further, they had to continue fighting. They had to continue to fill the battlefield with the essence of both sides. Only by changing the essence of the battlefield with enough essence could both sides have a chance to advance further. And this would obviously take a longer time. Of course, this change wasn't actually permanent. Karma and fate were extremely mysterious. In the beginning, this interweaving, this fusion, and this influence on victory and defeat might only be a situation that Luo Fan and the world will took the initiative to create. However, once the number of times this influence on victory and defeat continued to increase, when the number of changes increased to a certain extent, then this kind of karma would truly be established. At that time, even if there was no fusion of essence on the battlefield, the victory or defeat between the two spacetimes would truly be linked to the direction in which the boundary was pushed. In the end, it would result in one side continuously winning, and the boundary would continue to push forward, regardless of whether the other side's spacetime was retreating or whether the battlefield had gathered enough essence that belonged to both sides. Of course, this situation hadn't happened for the time being. This kind of distorted karma hadn't truly been established yet. Chapter 29-27. If it was just an ordinary cause and effect, it would naturally be an extremely simple matter to construct it. After all, Luo Fan could now sense various existences at the level of cause and effect at will. To him, as long as he made a certain change at the level of cause and effect, he would naturally be able to change a certain cause and effect, or sever a certain cause and effect, or construct a certain cause and effect. However, it was obvious that the scope of the changed cause and effect that could be rented was definitely limited. With the size of the world's will and Luo Fan's current ability to control the level, it was obviously an impossible task for him to change the cause and effect that he could truly affect the world's will, and thus the entire world. If he could do it, he would have directly divided the dimension to envelop the entire world and completely destroy it. Why would he need any other messy measures? Therefore, directly changing the cause and effect in the level of cause and effect, or directly performing a remarkable ability in the level of reality to distort and confiscate the cause and effect would obviously not be able to completely link the outcome of the battle with the position of the boundary. Only through such a conventional method could it be possible to make use of the world itself and Luo Fan's power, strength, and status to perfect the cause and effect bit by bit, and finally completely take shape. Of course, it was naturally not easy to completely form the cause and effect through such a method. It required a lot of time and energy, as well as the tacit cooperation of both parties. If one party suddenly regretted halfway, the final cause and effect would obviously not be able to take shape. At this time, it was only the first push of dozens of times. There was still an incomparably long way to truly form the cause and effect. This time, although Luo Fan's side had won, it was obviously only a small victory. Be it Luo Fan or the world's will, they did not think that this victory could determine the overall situation. Therefore, even the side of the world's will that had failed just now did not regret it, and did not continue the construction of this cause and effect. The victorious spacetime absorbed the dividends of the war and obtained great growth. This kind of growth obviously required time. As for those failed spacetimes, they obviously need to work hard to recover from the losses in the war, which obviously takes a lot of time. If it was in an ordinary world, such a situation would almost decide the outcome of the battle. From now on, the victorious side would bring more and more victories, while the loser would fall completely. The victorious side would gain an advantage, and the gap between them and the loser would widen. When the next battle begins, the chances of winning would naturally be higher. The next victory would begin the next round of the cycle. Just like that, the outcome of the battle would be determined. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan and the world's will were not willing to decide the outcome of the battle in a single battle. After all, none of them had absolute confidence that they could emerge victorious on every battlefield. Therefore, those spacetimes had many characteristics that normal spacetimes did not have. That was the independence of time. In those spacetimes, as long as the spacetimes inside and outside were separated, then the flow of time inside would no longer have any relationship with the flow of time outside. In other words, one day in the outside world could pass any time inside that spacetime. Perhaps it was a moment, perhaps it was a split second, perhaps it was 10 days, 100 days, 10 years, 100 years, or even billions of years. In such a situation, after every failure, there would be a new beginning. No matter how serious the damage to the spacetime was last time, no matter how much power was consumed in that spacetime, no matter how many experts died in it. When the next battle began, the situation might change dramatically. The victorious side might be at a disadvantage in terms of development, while the defeated side might gain more advantages and grow more perfectly than the victorious side. In this way, every battle could almost be regarded as a new beginning. The victory or defeat of the previous battle had almost no relationship with the victory or defeat of the next battle. This greatly increased the randomness of the victory or defeat of the war, made the outcome of the war more suspenseful, and made the process of establishing this cause and effect more exciting, with more possibilities. Clearly, whether it was Luo Fan or the world's will, this possibility was the fundamental reason why they were willing to form a tacit agreement. If there were not so many possibilities, whether it was Luo Fan or the world's will, it was obvious that neither of them would be willing to establish this cause and effect, and the impact of this possibility on the war was naturally to make the war last longer, making the time it would take for this cause and effect to be established even longer. At this moment, Luo Fan, who had obtained the first victory, began to shift his attention from the spacetimes outside the boundary that belonged to the world's will to the other spacetimes that had originally been seized by external forces. Those spacetimes had already undergone tremendous changes. They were vaguely breaking away from the tacit agreement that Luo Fan and the world's will had established. In other words, they were vaguely breaking away from the various restrictions that Luo Fan and the world's will had set at the same time. I see. How interesting. Suddenly, a voice rang in Luo Fan's ears. At the same time, a thunderous roar suddenly erupted in the sky out of nowhere. The thunderous roar was so loud, and the range it affected was so vast that it almost enveloped all the spacetimes on the boundary, causing all the living beings in the billions of spacetimes to simultaneously feel an indescribable anger emerging from the depths of their hearts. It really is you. What exactly do you want to achieve? Luo Fan sighed and said. The terrifying thunderous roar that covered all the spacetimes on the boundary and was heard by all the living beings in all the spacetimes was clearly from the world's will. Only the anger of the world's will could spread across such a vast area at the same time, and the only one who could make the world's will so angry was naturally the middle-aged man who had betrayed the world's will. However, although Luo Fan was sure that the middle-aged man was involved in all of this, he still had no idea where the middle-aged man was at this moment. At this moment, He could only sense that the middle-aged man's aura was faintly present in those spacetimes, as if he had directly treated those spacetimes as the carrier of his existence. This method was extremely brilliant. Even Luo Fan couldn't determine the middle-aged man's location at all, and he couldn't even be sure if he had really come to this area, or in other words, this boundary. My goal is, of course, to survive. Isn't this obvious? At this moment, a voice resounded in Luo Fan's ears. It was the middle-aged man's voice. The source of this voice was unknown, and it seemed to exist in all matter and laws, but it also seemed to be just an illusion that Luo Fan had. At this moment, the void became dark, and the thunderous roar appeared again. Countless living beings in the countless spacetimes in the void once again felt the fear that they had felt before at the same time. It was unknown how many existences were completely annihilated in this thunderous roar. In just an instant, an endless amount of electricity appeared in the form of threads on both sides of the border, directly shattering the huge amount of void on both sides of the border, making everything on both sides of the border look like it was formed by the accumulation of fragments. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's expression turned solemn. This was the will of the universe taking action. At this moment, he felt that everything that seemed to be the source of the voice was destroyed by the will of the universe at the same time. This place no longer belongs to you alone. At this moment, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. With a slight thought, the fragments on both sides of the border instantly gathered again, and in the blink of an eye, it had returned to the state before it was destroyed, as if nothing had happened. Why bother? What's here now is just a little bit of my power. So what if it's destroyed? At this moment the voice sounded again. However, although it was heard by Luo Fan this time, its target was clearly not Luo Fan. In Luo Fan's ears, the voice seemed rather distant, as if it was transmitted from the horizon. Hearing this voice, Luo Fan naturally understood that this existence was speaking to the will of the universe. You're a part of me. No matter how much time passes, and no matter what changes you make, you can't change this. At this moment, an extremely sonorous voice resounded in the world. However, although this voice was much more sonorous than the thunderous roar from before, it was also indescribably mysterious. Although it resounded throughout the heavens and earth, apart from existences at Luo Fan's level, it was impossible for any other existences to understand this voice. Even if this voice was just speaking, they would not be able to understand its content at all, and would not be able to determine what it was saying. So you're just a part of the predestined fate. Why are you wasting time now? At this moment, the voice that belonged to the middle-aged man rang out again. It still sounded extremely distant. The voice that belonged to the will of the universe in the sky did not ring out again. It seemed like the middle-aged man's words had poked a certain sore spot of the will of the universe, and it also seemed like the will of the universe had made up its mind to eliminate the middle-aged man. Faced with this situation, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, and he suddenly sighed in his heart. Looks like he's made up his mind to eliminate me. Next, perhaps we can form an alliance. At this moment, the middle-aged man's voice rang out in Luo Fan's ears. Compared to before, the middle-aged man's voice had lost its distant characteristic. It sounded like it was not far away, or even right next to him. At this time, facing such a voice, Luo Fan only faintly said, "Alliance? Even the weak can resist the strong? That sounds good. However, I don't believe you. Perhaps this is just a show that you're putting on." Just a show? Do you think you're qualified to make us put on this show? The middle-aged man's voice seemed to be suppressing some sort of disdain. Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression did not change at all. He only nodded indifferently and said, "That's right, I think I'm qualified." His words did not follow common sense at all, and it made the middle-aged man speechless for a moment. After a long while, his helpless voice rang out again, "You're thinking too much. Among the three of us, you're definitely the weakest. If it wasn't for the existence of that power behind you, you would have been crushed to death by now. Why do we need to care about your own power? You're just changing the concept, Luo Fan said indifferently, but he was not moved at all. The middle-aged man did not know what to say for a moment. There was no way to persuade Luo Fan just now, so no matter what he said next, it would obviously be useless. If he wanted to make Luo Fan truly sure that what he said was true, he could only produce strong evidence to prove this point. However, for now, it was clear that the strong evidence was to make Luo Fan feel how weak he was. It was to make Luo Fan completely understand that he was the weakest among the three parties. Moreover, he was the party that was countless times weaker than the other two parties. Once he did that, he would obviously have to attack Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, doing that was almost equivalent to shedding all pretense of cordiality with Luo Fan. Obviously, this was not a choice that he could make. If he could not do that, then there was no way to change Luo Fan's mind. All right, I can't make you believe this. The middle-aged man sighed, and could only change his original plan. Next, he did not contact Luo Fan again. Instead, he began to make further changes to the space-time that he controlled, so that the space-time that was originally breaking away from the tacit understanding between Luo Fan and the will of heaven and earth would gradually regain that tacit understanding. Furthermore, he began to build new rules on top of that tacit understanding. Chapter 29-28. That kind of power brought about an unimaginable chain reaction. Those spacetimes underwent increasingly intense changes due to that power. The nomological laws, time, space, matter, energy, and everything else seemed to be gradually distorted by that power. Those spacetimes had originally stopped their malice towards all spacetimes, whether it was towards the spacetimes that Luo Fan had opened up on the other side of the boundary, or towards the other spacetimes that were still under the control of the will of the world. However, all of this was changed by that inexplicable power. A kind of hostility gradually emerged from those spacetimes. This wasn't just an enmity directed at one of the three parties, but a common enmity directed at the other two parties. In other words, it was not just a hostility towards the spacetimes that Luo Fan had opened up on the other side of the boundary, but it was also a strong hostility towards the spacetimes that were still under the control of the will of the world. With this hostility, the style of those spacetimes began to change. Their original reserved attitude was completely broken. Instead, it was replaced by an unimaginable aggressiveness. Although there was no army yet, many living beings were sent out to explore other spacetimes that did not belong to them with the purpose of fighting. This was the case whether it was the spacetimes that belonged to Luo Fan or the spacetimes that belonged to the will of the world. Do you intend to use force? Luo Fan frowned at this time. This was clearly a fait accompli that the incarnation of the former will of the world intended to forcibly create a situation in which the three sides competed for hegemony. The three-way hegemony was obviously an extremely complicated battle situation. Joining forces with the weak to resist the strong was almost a basic operation in a hegemony battle. If such a situation was really created, even if Luo Fan did not trust the incarnation of the former will of the world, he was afraid that he would eventually be forced to cooperate with it due to the situation. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan was secretly a little displeased. Anyone who was forced by others to accept something that they were originally unwilling to accept would not feel very good. At this moment, a large patch of dark clouds appeared out of thin air. As if blotting out the sky and covering the earth, it completely covered the millions of spacetimes that had been controlled by the incarnation of the former will of the world. After the appearance of these dark clouds, an indescribable pressure naturally appeared. Rumbling sounds of thunder began to explode from the dark clouds. Then, an unknown number of lightning bolts were emitted from the dark clouds and blasted down on the millions of spacetimes below. In the blink of an eye, the countless lightning bolts had already brazenly inserted into the countless spacetimes and began to collide intensely with the barrier on the surface of that spacetime. Countless living beings that belonged to those spacetimes but did not belong to those spacetimes for various reasons died in an instant. These bolts of lightning were lightning that targeted spacetime, and they possessed unimaginable destructive power. It was easy to imagine how difficult it was for living beings to resist these bolts of lightning. It was naturally impossible for the living beings that belonged to those spacetimes to resist the lightning. From the moment they encountered the lightning, their deaths were already completely determined. The dark clouds continued to condense and thicken in the void. They did not stop even though the lightning had already exploded. It was as if there was an infinite source of power behind the dark clouds that was constantly emitting power to replenish the dark clouds. Although the lightning was constantly flickering and striking down, the sky was still visibly darkening and becoming terrifying. The millions of spacetimes seemed extremely fragile in the face of the lightning. Although the lightning was obstructed by the spacetime barrier and paused for a long time outside the spacetime, in the end, when the lightning continued to strengthen, the barrier still could not withstand the lightning and broke open. The lightning frantically surged in and began to wreak havoc, constantly destroying everything within the spacetime. In just the blink of an eye, the living beings within the spacetime had already been annihilated. The laws within the spacetime had already become chaotic under the destruction of the lightning, not to mention the existence of time and space. As the lightning wreaked havoc, everything was being destroyed at a speed visible to the naked eye. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan fell into deep thought, but he did not make any move to help the spacetime. At this moment, the former worlds will seem to be at an absolute disadvantage, as if the spacetime was already on the verge of destruction. However, Luo Fan understood in his heart that there would definitely be a turning point after this. There was no other reason other than the fact that the performance of the former world's will was simply too poor. Based on Luo Fan's understanding of the former world's will, even if it was just the spacetime that it had just gained control of, it would still be able to exert power that was billions of times greater than what it was displaying now. Just the defensive ability alone was impossible to only display a little bit of power at this moment. Yet, under such circumstances, the spacetime was actually so fragile. Even a fool would not believe that there was nothing wrong with it, let alone Luo Fan. Since he clearly knew that there was something wrong with the other party, and everything that was happening in front of him was just a facade and not the truth, how stupid would Luo Fan have to be to get involved and take the initiative to be used? The dark clouds that appeared out of nowhere in the sky became denser and more terrifying, and the lightning within also became brighter and more dazzling. Within the lightning, a power that far exceeded the original lightning gradually appeared, and it started to continuously mix with the lightning, causing the power of the lightning to become stronger, more agile, and more autonomous. Its destruction of the spacetime also became more and more thorough. Finally, at a certain moment, when the intensity of the lightning reached a certain limit, a strange, shattering sound spread throughout the void. The spacetime that was able to withstand the lightning finally couldn't withstand the attack of the lightning. Under the lightning, it completely disintegrated and turned into countless fragments that spread in all directions along with the impact of the explosion of the lightning. It shattered. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan was slightly puzzled. However, he still believed in his previous conjecture. He felt that this was just an intermediate process, and the turning point was still later, so he still did not take any action at this time. Obviously, the worlds will seem to think so too. At this time, even though the spacetime had already disintegrated and turned into countless spacetime fragments, it still did not stop. It continued to continuously strengthen the power of the dark clouds, increasing the changes in the lightning within the dark cloud. In other words, it was continuously strengthening the attack on the spacetime fragment. If it was not for the fact that the former world's will was still certain that the incarnation still had a way to reverse the situation, why would it waste its power like this? At this moment, Just when Luo Fan and the world's will were certain that the former world's will still had a way to reverse the situation, the dark clouds in the void suddenly began to surge. The surging dark clouds had existed from the beginning, and the reason why it was mentioned now was that the surging that had just begun was completely different from the surging that had appeared before. Although it seemed like the dark clouds were surging, this kind of surging was completely incompatible with the surging that had originally existed in the dark clouds. They had a strong conflict with the surging that had originally existed in the dark clouds. Amidst this conflict, the lightning within the dark clouds became chaotic, and a large amount of lightning began to attack the other lightning. Endless destructive power directly erupted within the dark clouds. This strange surging continued to strengthen, and the surging that had originally existed in the dark clouds gradually retreated under this surging. In just a brief moment, before the will of the heavens and earth could even react, 60% of the dark clouds had already changed owners. When the world's will finally shifted its attention from below to the dark clouds, the part of the dark clouds that had changed owners had already been completely separated from the rest of the dark clouds. Instead, it began to encircle the dark clouds that had yet to change owners and unleashed endless attacks on them. Compared to the original dark clouds, these dark clouds that had changed owners had an additional power that was different from the original dark cloud. This power fused with the attacks of the dark clouds, causing the attacks of the dark clouds to skyrocket by several times. Under this surge of attacks, the dark clouds that had yet to change owners and still belonged to the world's will quickly collapsed. By the time the world's will had regrouped, there was less than 10% of the dark clouds left. "How dare you!" The world's will's voice smashed down from the void. The void distorted intensely under this voice, and a kind of destructive might directly suppressed the void to the point that it began to distort strangely. It was as if everything had succumbed to this voice. Endless power was continuously born from the void, frantically pouring into the remaining dark clouds that had less than 10% of the dark clouds. It was doing its best to strengthen the dark clouds and allow them to escape from the predicament of only 10% of the dark clouds remaining. However, it was a pity that as the dark clouds strengthened, the remaining dark clouds that had changed owners also began to strengthen at the same time. As the remaining 10% of the dark clouds strengthened, the remaining 90% of the dark clouds also strengthened by the same amount. It was as if the power being poured into the dark clouds was also continuously strengthening the dark clouds that had changed owners. At that moment, Luo Fan seemed to sense something. With a thought, a wave of suppressive power swept over and instantly enveloped the area that was covered by the dark clouds for billions of light years. Under this suppressive power, everything in the void instantly came to a standstill. It was as if an unimaginable power had directly stopped time completely. As expected. At that moment, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. He casually grabbed at the void, and the suppressive power began to squirm and change slightly. Immediately after, some invisible existence was pushed by the suppressive power and started to continuously gather towards where he was. It was a kind of authority, the authority to control this part of the world. It originally belonged to the dark clouds in the sky and was also the fundamental authority that existed in this large area. Of course, the authority that was gathering towards Luo Fan was only the authority contained in the destroyed 30% of the dark cloud. It was also the portion of authority that the world's will and the former incarnation of the world's will were fighting over. That's right, the changes in the dark cloud seemed intense, but that wasn't the focus of their fight. Only this authority and this authority were the focus of their fight. Power was nothing to existences at the level of Luo Fan and the others. As long as they wanted to, they could casually create unlimited power at any time. For example, the power contained in the dark clouds and the power contained in the lightning were obviously nothing to them. As long as they wanted to, let alone these dark clouds, even if there were hundreds or thousands of times more dark clouds, they could casually create them. Since that was the case, if it was purely for power, there was naturally no need for them to fight over and destroy the dark cloud. Only the authority that belonged to this part of the world and a certain kind of authority that belonged to this part of the world was something that they couldn't casually create. This was also the focus of their fight. Previously, the former incarnation of the world's will had occupied 60% of the dark clouds, which clearly meant that it had completely occupied 60% of the authority. After that, it had destroyed the remaining 30% of the dark clouds because it had been discovered. This had caused the remaining 30% of the authority to collapse and scatter across the world, causing the world's will to be unable to directly control the authority. This gave it more time and more opportunities to control the authority. Now, what Luo Fan had done was to rely on the suppressive power to forcibly gather the scattered authority and make it fall into his hands. At this moment, another Luo Fan appeared out of thin air in front of Luo Fan. This was another incarnation of Luo Fan, which was also the incarnation that had fought with the former incarnation of the world's will in the spacetime core of the world. It was also an incarnation formed by the power derived from the collision with the power related to the true divine. At this moment, after this incarnation arrived, it casually made a grabbing motion and the authority quickly gathered in front of it. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into an extremely simple and unadorned seal. It floated in the air and emitted an indescribable mysterious charm. Rumble. The three-legged cauldron in the hands of the other incarnation of Luo Fan vibrated slightly, as if some kind of incredible power was attacking the three-legged cauldron and starting to shake its power. Chapter 29:29. This suppressive force could even suppress time, so it was natural that it could exist for a long time. If there was no resistance that could shake this suppressive force, let alone a short while, even billions of years or trillions of years would be nothing to this suppressive force. However, it was clear that this did not exist. At this moment, the world's will and the former world's will's incarnation both possessed great resistance against this suppressive force. At this moment, the resistance within the suppressive force was constantly strengthening. Vaguely, the resistance from the two sides seemed to have an inexplicable cooperation. Their powers complemented each other, and they started to shake the almost absolute suppressive force. At this moment, the cooperation between the two resistance was only at an extremely preliminary stage. They complemented each other, and most of the time, they did not interfere with each other. However, it was clear that the resistance could not remain at this level forever. As long as this suppressive force continued to exist, the cooperation between the resistance would definitely continue to deepen. Whether the strengthening of the resistance would have any effect on the suppressive force was secondary. More importantly, what this deepening represented was rather disadvantageous to Luo Fan. This was the deepening of the cooperation, and it clearly meant that the conflict between the world's will and the former world's will's incarnation was gradually easing, and there were signs of an alliance. This was something that Luo Fan did not want to see. Of course, if the suppressive force could really get rid of the world's will and the former world's incarnation, then he would naturally not care about the trend of the two forming an alliance. However, the suppressive force clearly could not do that. It must be known that whether it was the world's will or the former world's incarnation, none of them were in their true forms. There was no need to say anything more about the world's will. Its true form was in the depths of the void, in the spacetime where the world's will resided. What was here was only a little power spreading down, and it was not even an incarnation. It was the same for the former world's incarnation. At this moment, even the world's will could not find it. What was here was also just a little power. Under such circumstances, what would be the result of erasing both of them in an instant? At most, they would just destroy this place of karma that was constructed by mutual tacit understanding. For this, it was clearly not a smart choice to risk the world's will and the former world's incarnation forming an alliance against him. and Luo Fan was obviously smart enough, hence, at this moment, when he sensed the resistance that erupted from the suppressive power, he silently withdrew the suppressive power. The surroundings instantly became lively again. It was as if the existence that had stopped time had once again allowed time to flow. At this moment, the dark clouds went silent. Immediately after, the battle that was about to reach its climax completely stopped. Regardless of whether it was the portion of dark clouds controlled by the former incarnation of the world's will or the portion that was still under the control of the world's will, both of them began to converge at this moment. In the end, they turned into a seemingly solid cloud layer that hung high in the void. In the end, it's still 30%. Luo Fan sighed and looked at the 60% dark clouds with an inexplicable expression. The 60% dark clouds were the dark clouds controlled by the former incarnation of the will of the world. They contained 60% of the authority over this large region. The 60% authority, along with the 30% authority in Luo Fan's hands and the 10% authority in the world's will's hands, formed 100% authority over this vast region. Obtaining this 100% authority was equivalent to completely controlling this large region. Once this large region was controlled, it would be equivalent to completely dividing this large region from the hands of the world's will, allowing this large region to have a new owner. If Luo Fan obtained this authority, this region would become a source of power for him to resist the world's will. If the former incarnation of the world's will controlled this authority, it would be equivalent to him having a foothold, and he would no longer need to hide from the world's will like now. The former incarnation of the world's will had yet to appear. Luo Fan and the world's will had only confirmed that the incarnation had participated in this battlefield by relying on its familiarity with the incarnation. This seemed very mysterious, and it seemed that the former incarnation of the world's will had a very brilliant method. However, wasn't this also a form of helplessness? If it wasn't for the fact that the former incarnation of the world's will did not dare to appear in front of the world's will, and did not dare to directly face the world's will, why would he need to use these various methods to control time and space? Why would he not even be able to directly appear on this battlefield? If he could really personally appear on this battlefield and face the world's will, perhaps he would not obtain any more advantages than now, but it would definitely be many times easier than now. However, if he had his own foothold and was able to grasp all the authority in this region would obviously become his base. With this base, from today onwards, the former incarnation of the world's will would no longer be water without a source or a tree without root. At this step, he would truly have the qualifications to challenge the world's will. Of course, it was only the qualifications. Although this region was vast and boundless, and it could only be calculated in billions of light years, it was still an insignificant dot. However, compared to the entire world, it was still an insignificant dot. The difficulty of relying on this region to defeat the world's will was almost as difficult as an ant trying to conquer the entire universe. However, no matter how difficult it was still a breakthrough from 0 to 1. For the former incarnation of the world's will, its importance was obvious. Fellow, why don't you give this authority to me? I don't care what you want, as long as I have it. At this moment, a voice rang in Luo Fan's ears. This was the incarnation of the former world's will. The way it spoke was still extremely subtle and mysterious. It was as if everything in the world was speaking at the same time, but it was also as if a supreme being who was billions of light years away was locking onto this area and transmitting his voice. At this moment, Luo Fan only smiled faintly, and the incarnation that was holding the seal shook slightly and disappeared without a trace. He used his own actions to directly express his attitude. The former incarnation of the world's will could only sigh. He naturally knew that the possibility of Luo Fan agreeing to his request was extremely slim, and he had only spoken up with a sliver of hope. Now that Luo Fan had rejected him cleanly, it was within his expectations. Therefore, there was naturally no need for him to act like he was embarrassed into anger. For Luo Fan, his own base was not absolutely necessary. After all, he now had a large region that had been freed from the control of the world's will. The region that had been freed from the shackles of the world's will was the source of his power, and it was where he relied on to resist the world's will. In comparison, an additional region was just icing on the cake for him. It was not considered timely help at all. If one were to be truly rational, it did not seem unacceptable to give this authority to the incarnation of the former world's will. However, it was clear that the current Luo Fan could not do such a thing. Icing on the cake was also an addition, and it was also a benefit. Even though the incarnation of the former world's will was extremely close to him, and seemed to want to form an alliance with him, and was completely on the same side as him. However, this was only temporary. It was because he was forced by the situation. Seriously speaking, the incarnation of the former world's will and the world's will were actually on the same side. They were both born because of his seventh great calamity. If they wanted to continue to exist, they would eventually stand opposite him, and they would definitely fight to the death with him. As long as the time was right, such a thing would definitely happen. Since he knew that the other party would definitely stand on the opposite side, Luo Fan naturally would not pour his heart out to him, and naturally would not do things like giving benefits to the other party. Cooperation was cooperation. At most, he would cooperate with the other party, and in the process of fighting, he would only go around the other party to a certain extent. As for the benefits, not stopping the other party from taking them was already very principled. The normal way of doing things was to see benefits in cooperation. Even if it was benefits that had been previously agreed upon, the bottom line should be to seize as much as possible. In the end, it was impossible to hand over benefits to the other party without even thinking about it. The incarnation of the former worlds will obviously saw it very clearly. After being rejected by Luo Fan, it no longer continued to dwell on this topic, and began to use the 60% authority that it had in this area to start a limited control of this area. For a moment, the world trembled and time distorted. The countless space-time fragments that were originally shattered began to expand crazily like balloons at this moment. In just a few breaths' time, the huge amount of space-time fragments had already expanded into complete space-time. Originally, there were only millions of space-time fragments here. However, at this time, as the fragments expanded into complete space-time, the number of space-time directly increased by God knows how many billions of times. From the original millions of space-time, it turned into billions of space-time. The countless space-time densely gathered together, like stars in the void, full of vitality, and extraordinarily lively. All of this was caused by the incarnation of the former worlds while using its authority to manipulate the rules, laws, energy, and matter in this area to repair and perfect the space-time fragments. During this process, Luo Fan actually had the ability to stop it. After all, he also had 30% authority in this area. This authority was naturally not enough to directly distort the action of the 60% authority, but it was absolutely easy to stop it and prevent it from going so smoothly. However, it was clear that at that time, Luo Fan did not take any action at all. He just sat back and watched as the other party perfected these space-time and obtained a large number of space-time to participate in this war, or rather, to construct the cause and effect here. He had the right to stop it, but he did not, and the world's will was powerless. Luo Fan still had 30% authority, and could slightly shake the 60% authority. However, the will of the heavens and earth only possessed 10% of this authority. This 10% authority might have some effect on Luo Fan's 30% authority, and it could slightly distort the various orders issued by Luo Fan's 30% authority. However, for the incarnation of the former world's will's 60% authority, the effect was quite limited. The 60% authority only needed to be slightly guarded against, and it would be enough to make the 10% authority useless, unable to distort it in any way. The final result was like this. The incarnation of the former worlds will obtained, who knows how many billions of spacetime to participate in this tacit war of cause and effect. Although on the whole, the worlds will could not fundamentally stop the birth of these spacetime, it was clearly not completely helpless. At this time, when these spacetime had just been formed, and before civilizations similar to other spacetime had really been born, the spacetime under the control of the world's will began to move. A large number of living beings began to set out from those spacetime, and attacked the newly born spacetime. They wanted to take advantage of the situation where those spacetime had just been born and did not have enough powerful support to get rid of them first. Even with 60% authority, the incarnation of the former worlds will did not have any shortcuts to this kind of attack. It could only do its best to guide the power in those spacetime to resist the invaders. After all, this was the requirement of the cause and effect construction. With the ability of the incarnation of the former world's will, it could naturally directly take action and easily wipe out the invaders, but that would obviously destroy the tacit understanding between the three parties. At that time, this tacit understanding of cause and effect construction would no longer have any meaning. In that case, not only would the worlds will not tolerate him, but even Luo Fan would also directly attack him. Therefore, at this time, even if the many space-time powers that he had constructed were at a low point, he could only let those space-time powers resist the invaders. Chapter 29:30. In the beginning, the power controlled by the world's will was naturally victorious, while the spacetime controlled by the former world's will was gradually defeated. But soon, the spacetime controlled by the former world's will began to erupt with a strong resistance. More and more living beings took advantage of the spacetime near the edge being defeated to quickly gather power, give birth to living beings, and nurture a cultivation civilization. In the end, when the attacks landed on the spacetime had already gathered a certain amount of resistance. This was also because the spacetime was independent, which was why such a change occurred. Because the spacetime was independent, no matter how much time passed in the outside world, it did not have much effect on the inside. In other words, only a few breaths might have passed in the outside world, but billions of years might have passed in the spacetime. It was precisely because of this characteristic that the former incarnation of the will of the world had enough time to nurture enough resistance. The spacetime's resistance became stronger and stronger as time passed. In the end, when nearly 30% of the spacetime was defeated, the remaining spacetime finally produced enough power to fight against the other two sides. The commotion caused by the battle increased by who knows how many times. It finally had the atmosphere of one of the three sides. Seeing this, the world's will did not stop. Instead, it pushed forward its own power, sending more living beings and experts to suppress the spacetime formed by the former world's will. It planned to take advantage of the situation and defeat the former world's will in an all-out war. The former world's will incarnation was powerful enough, and the spacetime it controlled had gathered enough living beings. But it still did not have enough foundation. The power was still a little superficial. In the face of an all-out war, although its performance was commendable, it was still being defeated overall. This defeat would not cause the spacetime of the former world's will to be completely destroyed. After all, the spacetime was the foundation of its power, and it could not be created at will. Under such circumstances, the power derived from the spacetime could be destroyed and erased, but the spacetime must be preserved no matter what. Therefore, it was not only the incarnation of the world's will, but also the world's will and Luo Fan's will. In the process of battle, once time and space failed, and everything was completely exposed to the enemy's destructive power, it would definitely shift the time and space at the first instant. It would directly cause time and space to retreat, giving way to the place where the time and space were originally located. It would rather lose its territory than lose time and space. At this moment, the incarnation of the former world's will was no exception. Although they were constantly losing in the battle, they had perfectly protected their own spacetime. Even if there were millions or tens of millions of spacetimes that were on the verge of being destroyed, there was not a single spacetime that was truly destroyed in the end. However, on the other hand, the territory that they occupied was reduced by more than a tenth. Spacetime could protect him and allow him to escape, but not his territory. As for why the incarnation of the former will of the heavens and earth didn't continue to open up spacetime and give birth to living beings, just like how the fragments turned into complete spacetime. The reason was the same as how he couldn't directly attack the living beings that were attacking the spacetime that he controlled. This was the requirement of constructing karma. If you wanted to participate in this game, you had to obediently follow the rules. Otherwise, you could play by yourself, seeing that the spacetime controlled by the world's will was constantly nibbling away at the territory that the incarnation of the former world's will controlled. Luo Fan finally had no choice but to take action. Although he didn't intend to let the incarnation of the former world's will participate in this, it had now indeed participated in this battle. But now it had indeed participated, and it had forcefully torn off a large portion of its authority from the will of the world. Naturally, he couldn't sit back and watch as the world's will took back that portion of authority. Therefore, at this moment, when the world's will was constantly nibbling away at the territory of the incarnation of the former world's will, it was faintly shaking the 60% authority that the incarnation of the former world's will had over this region. He could only sigh, and with a thought, he let the spacetime that he controlled erupt with power and attack the territory of the world's will. This kind of attack wasn't out of the world's will's expectations. However, it didn't produce any sudden sneak attacks. The world's will didn't suffer much because of this. Naturally, it didn't occupy territory at all. However, at the same time, this kind of attack was not completely ineffective. At the very least, under this kind of attack, the world's will was no longer able to expand its advantage over the incarnation of the former world's will. After all, the spacetime power that the world's will controlled was ultimately limited. If it diverted some power in one direction, the power in the other direction would be weakened. Now, it clearly had to have enough power to resist the attack of the spacetime that Luo Fan controlled. The attack that was diverted towards the incarnation of the former world's will naturally weakened. Authority and territory did not correspond to one another. Authority only represented the strength of control, not the breadth of control. Therefore, the territory occupied by the incarnation of the former world's will with 60% authority was the smallest among the three parties. It wasn't even 1% of the other two parties' territories. However, the territory occupied by the world's will with only 10% authority was the largest among the three parties. It was even 2 or 3 times larger than the territory controlled by Luo Fan. The size of the territory represented the amount of resources it had and the strength of its foundation. Obviously, among the three parties, the world's will had the most resources and the strongest foundation. Therefore, even if he only had 10% of the authority in this area, his overall strength was still the strongest among the three parties. Of course, the world's will had the boundless world outside as its backer, and could continuously absorb the resources it needed from there. Meanwhile, Luo Fan could also obtain support from the area that had broken free from the shackles of the world's will. Both parties were barely equal, even though there was a huge disparity in the size of the area compared to these spacetimes, whether it was the area that had broken free from the shackles or the wider spacetime outside, they could be considered to be infinitely vast. What restricted these spacetimes from absorbing resources and foundation was not the size of those areas, but the ability of those spacetimes to absorb and digest resources. In this way, even if there was a huge disparity between the breadth of the two backers, it wouldn't affect the support those spacetimes received much. In contrast, the incarnation of the world's will did not have such convenience. For it, its only backer now was the incarnation of the world's will itself. Or to be more specific, it was the extremely high intrinsic power that formed the incarnation of the world's will. However, although the intrinsic power was high, its scale could not compare to the vast area of the world. Therefore, this difference in backer caused the territory of the incarnation of the world's will to be much shallower than the territories controlled by Luo Fan and the world's will. If it was not for the fact that it had 60% authority, which far surpassed Luo Fan and the world's will, it would not have had the right to establish a foothold here and become one of the three parties. However, even so, the main body of the war could not become the incarnation of the world's will. The main body of the war was still Luo Fan and the world's will. It could be said that although the incarnation of the world's will had forcibly torn a line in the battlefield and inserted itself into the battlefield that it could not have inserted itself into, it was ultimately just a form of adjustment. Due to their own reasons, Luo Fan and the world's will would pay attention to the incarnation of the world's will. However, if they did not pay attention to it, its existence would not have much of an impact on the situation. Under the rules of the battlefield, once the spacetime made a move, there would be a connection between the spacetime, and the independence of the spacetime would naturally be lost. This meant that once the spacetime sent forces to participate in the war, the spacetime would also lose the qualification to continue brewing power and nurture its own living beings and powerhouses. Therefore, by sending forces to hold back the enemy, one's own spacetime would continue to grow and develop for millions of years in a short period of time. It would be impossible for it to grow for hundreds of millions of years. Of course, there were also many loopholes in this. However, as time passed, as the war progressed, and as the cause and effect gradually took effect, those loopholes were naturally filled up more and more. As a result, the rules of the battlefield on both sides naturally became more and more perfect. The battle that followed was not one-sided. Between Luo Fan and the world's will, neither side would always win and the other side would always lose. In the first place, the battle strength of both sides was not much different. Naturally, both sides would win and lose. Occasionally, it would be Luo Fan who would win, and occasionally, it would be the world's will who would win. However, because the cause and effect had yet to be truly constructed, the outcome of this battle was more dependent on the transformation of the environment at the intersection of their territories, so that at a certain moment, when the conditions were right, the nature of the battle would naturally be linked to the overall outcome. Therefore, although both sides had wins and losses, there were not too many fluctuations in each other's territories. On one side, the battlefield was in full swing. On the other side, the incarnation of the former will of the world was also very good at stirring shit. Sometimes it would attack the will of the world, and sometimes it would attack Luo Fan. As long as one side gained the upper hand, it would attack. Thus, it would do its best to balance the power of both sides and maintain the overall situation of the battlefield in the most advantageous state. Although this method was annoying, it could also be considered as an active transformation of the environment at the intersection of the three sides. The power of the three sides intertwined at the intersection, and the living beings that belonged to the three sides continuously died there. Essence and blood continuously seeped into the seawater and the void, and finally, the intersection gradually gained the characteristics of the three sides. This characteristic was not too strong now, but as time passed, this characteristic would definitely gradually strengthen. At a certain point, this characteristic would definitely make the location at the intersection truly linked to the victory and defeat of the three sides. Time continued to pass in this seemingly orderly yet seemingly chaotic war. Unknowingly, more than 10,000 years had passed. Whether it was Luo Fan, the world's will, or the incarnation of the world's will, all of them clearly knew that it was almost time. In these 10,000 years, the number of battles that broke out between the three sides would probably be counted in the hundreds of millions. At the intersection of the three sides' territories, the characteristics of spacetime, matter, and laws had almost truly intertwined with the characteristics of the three sides. In other words, the ownership of those territories was almost truly linked to the victory and defeat of the war. Although it was said to be the intersection of the three sides, only a small area that belonged to the incarnation of the worlds will truly belonged to the three side. As for the other, even wider boundary, it was the boundary between the territories of Luo Fan and the will of the heavens and earth. In other words, even if Luo Fan and the world's will did not obstruct the incarnation of the former world's will, at most, it could only occupy a small area around the former world's will and turn it into its own territory. For both sides, this was only a small and insignificant territory, and it did not matter at all. As for Luo Fan and the world's will itself, if they were to sit back and watch each other attack, the final outcome would be something that neither side would be willing to bear. Therefore, it was self-evident what Luo Fan and the world's will were guarding against. The former incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth also took advantage of this opportunity to amass its own strength. It planned to take advantage of the opportunity to expand its territory once again so that it could obtain greater battle potential and become an indispensable part of the three parties. The opportunity came very quickly. When the final battle to make up for the characteristics of the intersection was completed, the ownership of the territory at the intersection of the three sides was truly linked to the victory and defeat of the next war. The three sides coincidentally fell into the calm before the storm. The three sides began to gather their strength with all their might, preparing for the grand war that would inevitably erupt and determine the ownership of their territories. Chapter 29:31. After brewing for a while, the war finally broke out. The main body of the war was naturally between Luo Fan and the world's will. After all, compared to these two, the territory occupied by the incarnation of the former world's will, which was the third party, was far too small. Although it was known as one of the three parties, in terms of territory, the former world's will's side was simply not enough. Although the former world's will's incarnation was not targeted, it was not easy for it either. Although the main body of the war was the other two parties, since it was one of the three parties, it was naturally impossible for Luo Fan and the world's will to ignore it. Even if their true targets were each other, they still divided some power to guard against the former world's will's incarnation. Compared to their overall strength, this defensive power was not much. In terms of the size of the territory, this power was enough to deal with the former world's will's territory. However, it was obvious that the former world's will's incarnation did not only rely on its own territory. The reason why the territory it occupied was so small was because it had intervened too late, and did not intervene in this war that could be considered tacit understanding from the start. It did not mean that its strength was limited to this small territory. In fact, the number of spacetimes that he had created in this territory was tens of thousands of times more than what he could normally create. This was tens of thousands of times more spacetimes. Although it was not enough for its strength to become tens of thousands of times stronger than normal, it was definitely not a problem. It was definitely not a problem for it to have hundreds or thousands of times more spacetimes. Therefore, in the face of the defensive power that Luo Fan and the world's will had divided according to the size of the territory, the former world's will's incarnation was quite relaxed. If it was willing, it would not take much effort to destroy the defensive power and complete the victory of this part of the war. However, it was obvious that it could not destroy the defensive power right from the start. After all, no matter how fast it moved and how far it pushed, what could it do? The area that had changed in nature was only an area around its territory that was several times the size of its territory. In other words, no matter how fast he moved and how great the advantage he obtained, before the karma of war was truly established, his territory could only expand to the area around him that was several times the size of his original territory. Even if he completed the expansion of his territory on the first day, he could only watch helplessly in the following battles, even if it took thousands of years, without being able to interfere at all. They even had to guard against the threat of the other two parties and protect the territories that they had just occupied and had yet to be completely converted. Under such circumstances, making the first move would only be asking for trouble. On the contrary, it would be better for him to watch from the side and wait for the war to come to an end. When Luo Fan and the world's will no longer have the strength to do anything to him, then he would make his move. That way, Luo Fan and the world's will would not have the time or energy to make this part of the battlefield change. Because of this consideration, while the main battlefield was in full swing, this part of the battlefield was relatively calm. It was like a peaceful harbor amidst the endless chaos. Be it Luo Fan or the world's will, both of them understood the considerations of this incarnation of the world's will. However, at this moment, they clearly did not have the mood to care about the situation of the incarnation of the world's will. To them, the most important thing at the moment was obviously each other. The construction of the karma seemed to only need to link the outcome of the war with the ownership of the territory. On the surface, it seemed like it did not matter who won or lost. As long as the construction of the karma was successful, it seemed like there was still time to directly use the completed karma to determine the ownership of the territory. After all, this world was simply too vast and boundless. Even if the world's will failed thousands of times, the territory that it lost would only be an insignificant small part of this world. After the construction of the karma was completed, with the world's will's foundation, it would be able to gather most of the world's power in a matter of minutes and use the war's karma to push back, directly defeating Luo Fan's side in the war and taking back the territory that Luo Fan had worked hard to occupy for a long time. In fact, it could even completely take away the territory that Luo Fan originally had. However, it was obvious that this reasoning seemed to make sense, but in fact, there were too many things that could be taken for granted. How could karma be such a simple thing? How could the difference in the construction of the karma have no effect on the final form of the karma? In the process of the construction of the karma, Luo Fan's side won again and again, and there were wins and losses. How could it be the same? If the world's will really completely gave up on winning in the process of the construction of the karma and only cooperated with Luo Fan to complete the necessary requirements of the construction of the karma, then the final result would definitely be extremely disadvantageous to the world's will. Because Luo Fan won continuously and didn't lose at all. In the end, the karma that was constructed would probably be formed based on the foundation of Luo Fan's continuous victories and no losses. At that time, the karma might only be able to turn the battlefield into Luo Fan's territory if Luo Fan won, and turn into a state where he could break free from the shackles of the world's will. On the contrary, if the world's will won, perhaps this karma wouldn't recognize it, and wouldn't turn the battlefield into a state where it was controlled by the world's will, or in other words, a state where it was shackled. Of course, this was an outcome that would only occur under the most extreme circumstances. However, everyone had to admit that if it really developed in this way, this trend was inevitable regardless of whether it was Luo Fan or the world's will. Both of them were extremely clear about this. Therefore, both sides couldn't allow the other to obtain too many victories in the construction of the karma. It would be best if the other party couldn't obtain even a single victory. Of course, the possibility of this was extremely slim as well. That was the case for extreme circumstances. Even if it wasn't extreme, it would still have a great impact on the final form of the karma. In this battle, the side that won more times and occupied more territory would definitely obtain a certain advantage in the final form of the karma. In other words, it would be preferential treatment. However, this was unavoidable. After all, just like how absolute fairness couldn't be achieved, an absolutely balanced karma that treated both sides equally couldn't exist either. This was especially so for the karma that was constructed by the tacit understanding of both sides. Of course, at this time, It was no longer just two sides that were participating in the construction of the karma. Instead, it had become three parties. With the participation of a third party, the final form of the karma would obviously be even more complicated, and the changes would obviously be even more subtle. In reality, whether it was Luo Fan or the world's will, they clearly didn't have absolute confidence that they would be able to gain the upper hand in the construction of the karma and make the final form of the karma beneficial to their side. It was precisely because of this that they had allowed the participation of a third party after some hesitation. This would increase the complexity of the construction of the karma, making the final form of the karma even more complicated. The changes wouldn't have to be so simple. As long as the changes weren't simple, then both sides would have many ways to make use of the karma. They would play to their strengths and avoid their weaknesses, and they would naturally have more room to maneuver. Of course, this was just some sort of tacit understanding between the two sides. Perhaps the incarnation of the world's will knew this, which was why it dared to participate and become the third party in this extremely long battle. The war this time lasted for nearly 100 years before the result was out. The final outcome wasn't unexpected. Luo Fan and the world's will were roughly equal. In some areas, Luo Fan won, while in other areas, the world's will won. This kind of intertwining of victory and defeat caused the border between the two sides to become uneven, and it looked even more irregular. This was the result of the true comparison of strength between the two sides. Just like before, Luo Fan's side had obtained an absolute advantage and complete victory, and had completely pushed their territory outwards. This was only caused by an unexpected change. The battlefield that belonged to the two sides was like this. On the other side, the battlefield that belonged to the three sides was not unexpected by the incarnation of the world's will. At the end of the battle, the incarnation of the world's will saw that the power of Luo Fan and the world's will had been exhausted, and the outcome of the battle was about to appear. As such, the incarnation of the world's will brazenly made a move, waving the power of many spacetimes in its territory. Billions of troops directly set off, and forcibly occupied the area where the three sides' characteristics intertwined, pushing its territory outwards by several times. Although the territory that originally belonged to the incarnation of the world's will was generally connected, the way it was occupied at the beginning was a little special. Hence, many spacetimes that belonged to the other two sides were actually full of potholes. Now, with the incarnation of the world's will seizing the opportunity, the spacetimes that originally belonged to the other two sides were finally completely expelled. The spacetimes that belonged to the incarnation of the world's will were finally completely connected, and became a smooth territory without any gaps. Although this territory was many times smaller than the territories of Luo Fan and the world's will, it was at least a relatively pure and condensed entity. It could be said that in this war that had lasted for more than 10,000 years, the incarnation of the world's will was the true final victor. In comparison, be it Luo Fan or the world's will, they only did not suffer a loss in the hands of the other side, but they actually suffered a small loss in the hands of the incarnation of the world's will. However, in this situation, be it the world's will or Luo Fan, neither of them lost their composure because of this. After all, the territory of the incarnation of the world's will did not match its strength. If one's territory fell behind in terms of strength, then the territory would naturally continue to grow until it was barely compatible with the territory before it would stop. It could be said that it was not just this time. In the next few wars, the situation of the three sides would actually be similar to this time. At most, it would be between Luo Fan and the world's will, who would be able to gain more advantage over the other side. This was the true suspense of the war. The development of the situation was indeed as Luo Fan had expected. In the following hundreds of wars, which lasted for more than 1,000,000 years, the situation of the wars between the three parties was similar to the situation of that war. The territory of Luo Fan and the world's will did not change much. At most, Luo Fan relied on various strange ideas to gain a little advantage over the world's will, allowing his territory to expand. On the other hand, the incarnation of the world's will relied on its own strength, which far exceeded that of the original territory, to expand its territory to a degree that was hundreds of times greater than before. It could be considered as snatching food from the tiger's mouth, obtaining enough territory that was compatible with its own strength from Luo Fan and the world's will. Of course, even if it expanded by hundreds of times, the area of the territory was actually not that big compared to the territory of Luo Fan and the world's will. At most, it was around 5% of Luo Fan's territory. On the other hand, the territory that was equivalent to the world's will was only around 3%. At this stage, the incarnation of the world's will finally stopped. This territory and his strength had roughly matched each other. In this way, the power that Luo Fan and the will of the heavens and the will of the heavens and earth would be roughly equal to the power that Luo Fan controlled. Although seriously speaking, its power was still greater than its territory. But in the end, they were already on the same level. In this case, the former incarnation of the will of the world had clearly lost the opportunity to take advantage of the fight between Luo Fan and the will of the world to reap the benefit. From now on, if he wanted to improve and expand his territory, he would have to obediently gnaw on the hard bones and slowly seize territory from the hands of Luo Fan and the will of heaven and earth. Of course, at the same time, the territory in his hands finally had value to Luo Fan and the will of the world. At this moment, the battle between the three parties for hegemony could be considered to have truly taken shape. Even the weak fighting the strong, at this moment, could be considered to have a concrete value. On this day, Luo Fan inwardly sighed as he looked at the karma that was still far from forming. Constructing karma is much more difficult than I imagined. Chapter 29:32. Do you really intend to work with him? At this moment, an extremely mysterious voice suddenly rang in Luo Fan's ears. This voice was extremely peculiar. It was the product of all the sounds produced by everything in the surroundings gathered together. It felt like the appearance of this voice was just a coincidence. It was just that countless sounds had combined to form this seemingly meaningful sentence. However, in reality, Luo Fan could tell at a glance that the source of this voice was actually the controller of this world. In other words, it was the consciousness of this world, the world's will. At this moment, the way it spoke was by directly controlling its body to speak. It was precisely because of this that he was able to communicate with Luo Fan without his consciousness truly descending. In other words, he was able to communicate with everything in this world. This method was like how an ordinary person spoke. Although it seemed strange, in reality, it was more technical than directly speaking to Luo Fan with its consciousness incarnation. Previously, when it spoke to Luo Fan with its consciousness incarnation, it was like an ordinary person directly condensing their consciousness and materializing it in their body to communicate with something in their body. Compared to speaking directly with one's real body and transmitting one's voice directly to that part of the body, the technique required was obviously much higher. Of course, the world's will was not using this relatively low technical method just for novelty. Instead, it was because this relatively low technical method of speaking was more suitable at this moment. Although this method of speaking was relatively low technical, from a certain perspective it was more obscure. If it used the consciousness incarnation to speak, the former world's will would definitely sense it and immediately focus its attention on it. For ordinary living beings, using the consciousness incarnation to speak was more obscure and difficult to detect. However, they were only ordinary living beings. To existences at the level of Luo Fan and the former incarnation of the will of the world, this kind of obscure will fluctuation was much more obvious than ordinary sound fluctuations, and it was much easier to detect them. This was why the world's will had made this choice. Hearing the voice gathered by the world's will, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "What's wrong with that?" Aren't you worried that all the conflicts between us were just an act for you? The surrounding voices continued to be heard. Acting? That's even better. If that's the case, he can take up more of your energy. Luo Fan did not care at all and smiled faintly. To him, it did not matter whether the world's will and the former world's will incarnation were acting or whether there were conflicts between them. After all, what they were doing now was constructing karma. What the final form of karma would look like completely depended on how the process of constructing the karma was. Since that was the case, then as long as the process of constructing the karma was accepted by everything in the world, accepted by the river of karma, and made it believe that the entire process was the way it was now, then the final karma would definitely be formed according to what Luo Fan knew. Under such circumstances, the true relationship between the incarnation of the former will of the world and the will of the world was obviously of little significance to Luo Fan. This was still the result of everything being under the control of the world's will. In reality, it was almost impossible for the real situation to proceed according to the world's will's will. Even if what the world's will said was true, even if the world's will and the former world's will incarnation were putting on an act at the beginning, and were purposely showing discord and conflict in front of Luo Fan. However, as time passed and they gradually split up, it was very likely that the originally non-existent conflicts and fake conflicts would really take shape after 1,000,000 years. After all, it was not easy to hide it from Luo Fan. Since it had completely hidden it from him, it meant that even if not all of the conflicts between them were real, a large part of them was real. Most of these true contradictions, given enough time to develop, would definitely allow the incarnation of the former will of the heavens and earth to truly stand against the will of the heavens and earth. Before this, Luo Fan's guess was just a guess. Now that the world's will was talking to him directly, it obviously proved this point. If it was really as the world's will said, why would the world's will need to appear here to doubt Luo Fan and stop him from cooperating with the former world's will? If everything was going according to the world's will's plan, then what was the point of the world's will saying such a thing at this time? If Luo Fan believed him and fell out with the former world's will and did not cooperate, wouldn't he lose a chance to plot against Luo Fan? If Luo Fan did not believe him and planted a seed of doubt in his heart, then wouldn't it be a big trouble for him to plot against Luo Fan in the future? Therefore, at this moment, the will of the heavens and earth had directly spoken to him. Clearly, it had indirectly confirmed Luo Fan's conjecture, allowing him to confirm that no matter what the previous incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth was now standing opposite to the will of the heavens and earth. What a pity! The surrounding voices came again, and then the original chaos, or rather, the natural state was restored. However, he could no longer hear any other words. At this time, he suddenly felt an indescribable pressure appear from nothingness. Then, the figure of a middle-aged man directly formed with the help of the pressure and appeared not far away from Luo Fan. That was the former world's will's avatar, which was also the individual that was formed by the power that took form in Luo Fan. Looks like you've been monitoring this place at all times. Luo Fan only smiled faintly. Isn't that only natural? Don't tell me you haven't been monitoring my entire territory at all times? We're in the middle of a war right now. The middle-aged man smiled and said. The middle-aged man that appeared at this time was only a projection formed by a bit of pressure. He was not even an avatar. As for his real body, it was still hidden in some unknown place in this world. Although Luo Fan wanted to confirm the middle-aged man's location, he still wisely gave up on this thought. The will of heaven and earth was the ruler of this world, the consciousness of this world, yet it had no way of finding the specific location of this middle-aged man. He had even encountered layers of shackles and restrictions here, so how could he surpass the will of heaven and earth and lock onto his true location? It was better to save some energy and do less useless things. So, what are you planning to achieve by appearing here now? Luo Fan asked with a faint smile, not dwelling on the issue of monitoring. This was just a very ordinary void dojo. Although it had gradually developed all sorts of mysteries because it had been here for more than 1,000,000 years, it was ultimately just a void dojo. For the living beings in the space-time created by the three factions, this was a place that could only be seen but not reached. In fact, only true powerhouses could see this void dojo. However, for existences like Luo Fan and the others, there was not much of an obstacle. If they wanted to, it would not be difficult for them to directly monitor this place. The incarnation of the former will of the heavens and earth had completely locked onto the movements here and clearly knew everything that was happening here. Although this made Luo Fan, who couldn't sense anything, feel slightly surprised, it wasn't a big deal. Of course it's cooperation. This time, let's tear off a large piece of territory from him. The reason why the wars over the years have not had much effect on the karma construction is perhaps because the outcome of the war has not been clear, the middle-aged man said with a faint smile. His words were filled with an indescribable ambition, and his boldness was so grand that it could shake people's hearts. Of course, this was nothing to Luo Fan. I feel that the reason the karma construction has not had much effect is because of your participation, Luo Fan said. Perhaps, but I have already participated. You can't possibly risk everything turning into bubbles to get rid of me, right? The avatar of the former worlds will said calmly. It was not an impossible task to get rid of the avatar of the former world's will. If Luo Fan and the world's will were willing to stop fighting each other in the next war and focus all their power on the territory of the avatar of the former world's will, they would definitely be able to completely destroy the avatar of the former world's will. At the very least, they would be able to force its true body to take the initiative. If that was the case, it would not have the right to participate in the karma construction. However, once that happened, the balance that they had worked hard to maintain for over 1,000,000 years would be completely destroyed. When that time came, the embryonic form of the karma that showed faint signs of taking shape would completely collapse. Obviously, this was not something that Luo Fan or the world's will was willing to accept. Therefore, no matter how dissatisfied they were with the avatar of the former world's will, they still had to give it a glimmer of hope so that it could continue. This was the reason why the avatar of the former world's will was so calm. Luo Fan shook his head and said, "Of course not. However, there are many methods that can be used in a war. We don't necessarily have to completely get rid of you to achieve our goal. The prerequisite is that you can convince him." The avatar of the former worlds will interrupted and stated the premise that Luo Fan did not mention. Indeed, there were many methods in a war that could isolate the avatar of the former world's will from the main battlefield. However, this kind of isolation required the full cooperation of Luo Fan and the world's will to achieve the goal. Obviously, it was impossible for Luo Fan and the world's will to cooperate. The reason why Luo Fan and the world's will could have such a tacit understanding to construct this karma was because they wanted to break the original stalemate. The world's will wanted to make use of this karma to bypass the power related to the true divine and devour the territory that Luo Fan occupied so that Luo Fan could return to his original helpless state and be completely suppressed. Therefore, he needed to construct this karma. And Luo Fan needed this karma even more. After all, if he didn't have such karma, then he would be facing this boundlessly vast world that was countless times larger than the world he could deal with. Even if he worked hard for billions of trillion years, he might not be able to deal with such an enemy. In the end, he might have to think of a way to activate the power that was related to the true divine and use a method that was close to perishing together with the enemy. Only then would he be able to destroy the world, and once this cause and effect was formed, then the originally incomparably shocking size of the world would be completely transformed into another form, and it would become the outcome of many battles. Something that was illusory would become something that could be grasped. In this case, it was obviously more meaningful to Luo Fan. It was precisely because the construction of this karma was so meaningful to both of them that they had a tacit understanding to construct this karma together. Without this common effect, the conflict between them would probably be enough for them to fight to the death the moment they met. Under such circumstances, how could they work together? Even if it was something like getting rid of the incarnation of the former world's will, it was not enough for them to put aside their conflict and work together without any ill feelings. Of course, more importantly, the participation of the incarnation of the former world's will was the result of their conscious control. Now, it was naturally impossible for them to completely overturn their original decision because of such a small matter and directly work together to get rid of it. At the very least, it was impossible for both of them to completely overturn their original decision at the same time. Since it was impossible for them to completely overturn their original decision at the same time, it was even more impossible for them to work together. Luo Fan did not pause for too long. After a while, he calmly discussed with the incarnation of the former world's will on how to work together. Working together with the incarnation of the former world's will was originally the biggest idea that Luo Fan had in letting it participate as a third party. Now that the time was right, of course, they would begin to act according to the original plan. Very soon, the figure of the middle-aged man had completely disappeared in front of Luo Fan. Even the inexplicable pressure had disappeared at the same time, as if it had never existed. Chapter 29:33. It was as if some kind of change that was beyond anyone's control had truly taken shape after Luo Fan and the incarnation of the former worlds will reached a consensus. During this change, the many spacetimes in the territory of the worlds will seem to have lost something that could not be described with words. At the same time, Luo Fan also felt that the many spacetimes in his territory seemed to have vaguely obtained something. At the same time, he could also feel that the spacetimes in the territory of the former worlds will seemed to have also obtained something. Unfortunately, you made a wrong decision. At this moment, an inexplicable voice suddenly sounded from all directions at the same time. In the end, it converged into this sentence and entered Luo Fan's ears. This was obviously the world's will speaking again. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly sensed something. His gaze instantly pierced through the battlefield that was countless trillions of light years away and looked towards the wider world outside the battlefield. The moment he looked over, he was shocked to see that in the vast world outside the battlefield, there were suddenly countless rays of light that appeared out of nowhere. These rays of light were so mysterious and strange. They existed between the heavens and the earth in an overwhelming manner. It seemed like everything in the world had turned into this kind of light. These rays of light were like rivers flowing into the sea. They frantically gathered towards the battlefield and continuously fused with the many spacetimes that belonged to the world's will. During this process, the spacetimes began to expand continuously, and the power in the spacetimes increased endlessly. In just a short while, the power belonging to the world's will had skyrocketed by several times. This sudden surge caused the karma that had formed a little outline to instantly collapse again. Although it had not completely cut off the hope of successfully constructing the karma, it had already taken a huge step back. In terms of the number of victories and losses, the original outline of the karma was equivalent to the outline of the karma formed after hundreds of victories and losses. But now it was only equivalent to the progress of constructing the karma after 1 or 2 victories and losses. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's expression instantly became extremely ugly. "You are challenging my bottom line," he said coldly. "So, has this crossed your bottom line?" The will of the heaven and earth asked calmly. Luo Fan's expression became even more unsightly. He raised his head, and his eyes seemed to penetrate the barrier of endless space-time, directly looking at the space-time where the will of heaven and earth resided. There was a huge hole there, which was still the same as before. In the hole, countless strange runes were constantly swimming and surging, filling up the hole. Around the hole, the surrounding spacetime was being stimulated to shrink, carrying out various complicated confrontations with those strange runes, wanting to completely erase those runes and completely close the hole. The two of them formed an indescribable balance, causing the hole to no longer shrink or expand during this process. This appearance did not seem much different from before. However, a small dot had appeared around the hole. It was a blurry, indistinct, faintly discernible dot that seemed both real and illusory at the same time. This dot was extremely subtle, and its size was only a few light-years in radius. Compared to the hole that Luo Fan had opened up previously, it was simply insignificant. Compared to the entire spacetime, it was even more insignificant. However, the area of its existence was still calculated in light-years. From an absolute point of view, its size could not be considered small no matter how one looked at it. No matter how one looked at it, it was not a small matter for such a hole to suddenly appear in a spacetime. Although the hole was only indistinct, and seemed both real and fake at the moment, if it was allowed to continue developing, the impact on the spacetime in the end would obviously not be negligible. Unlike the huge hole, there was an extremely unique aura in the small dot that seemed to be both real and illusory. This aura seemed to be rather similar to the spacetime aura, but it was fundamentally different from the spacetime aura. The two seemed to have an extremely strong affinity, but also seemed to be incompatible. It was as if some kind of unbelievable confrontation was brewing at the border between them. With just one look, Luo Fan knew that this illusory dot was actually the mark that the former incarnation of the world's will had left on the place where the world's will resided. As for why it would leave a mark there, the reason was very simple. It was because he had truly become a third party in this battle to construct the cause and effect. This constructed cause and effect linked the territories of the participating parties to the outcome of the battle. For Luo Fan, if he won, his territory would expand, which also meant that the areas that had broken free from the shackles of the world's will would become even larger. The areas that had broken free from the shackles of the world's will corresponded to the spacetime where the world's will resided. It was the holes that had appeared out of thin air in the spacetime. In other words, if the cause and effect was successfully constructed, Luo Fan's victory or defeat would be directly linked to the size of the holes. If Luo Fan's karma were to completely devour the entire world after it was formed, then this hole would probably expand to the point where it would completely fill up the entire spacetime. If this was the case for Luo Fan, the other participants in the battle would naturally be the same. The world's will and the former incarnation of the world's will, which had now become a third party, would also enjoy the same treatment. At this moment, the cause and effect had not truly taken shape, and there was only a vague outline in its embryonic form. However, the effects were already there. In this part of the world, the former incarnation of the world's will had clearly occupied a part of the battlefield. Although it was not big, it was still a territory that had been recognized by Luo Fan and the world's will. In other words, if the cause and effect were to take shape now, then this part of the territory would be completely under his control and completely break free from the control of the world's will. In this way, this part of the territory would be equivalent to breaking free from the shackles of the world's will. And this breaking free from the shackles would also mean that a corresponding hole would appear in the spacetime where the world's will resided. It was a tiny, faintly discernible, indistinct, illusory little hole. This was the origin of the small dot. At this moment, the small dot quickly became illusory, and in the end, only a blurry, indistinct trace was left. If Luo Fan had not noticed this place long ago and clearly seen that the small dot had turned from its original appearance to its current state, he might not have discovered the existence of this trace. He might not have even discovered the existence of this trace. The reason for this change was obviously because the embryonic outline of the cause and effect, which had already taken shape, had been broken up again. Because the outline of the cause and effect had been broken up again, The small dot that had appeared based on the outline of the cause and effect had naturally gradually shrunk until only a trace was left. One could imagine that if this continued, when the cause and effect had completely lost all hope of taking shape, this trace would probably be completely erased. Angry from embarrassment? At this moment, a voice came from afar. As this voice spoke, an indescribable pressure appeared again. Following this pressure, the figure of a middle-aged man appeared out of thin air and appeared not far away from Luo Fan. He was also facing the surrounding void and the residence of the world's will that existed in the depths of the void. Are you planning to give up? Similar voices converged in the surroundings once again. There seemed to be a sense of anticipation and disdain in the voices. Give up? No, no, no. Now is not the time to give up, Luo Fan said calmly at this moment. As he spoke, an endless amount of energy suddenly erupted from the area that had broken free from the world's will's shackles and frantically poured into the battlefield. The space-time he had created started to grow tremendously, so the aura that the space-time emitted was not inferior to the many space-times in the territory controlled by the world's will. As he moved, the traces that belonged to the previous incarnation of the world's will on the residents of the world's will became increasingly indistinct. Previously, the traces were still relatively clear. As long as one looked closely, they could still be seen. However, now that the traces had weakened once again, they had reached the point where they could no longer be seen even if one looked closely. Only a slight sense of existence could let Luo Fan know where the traces were. Only then could he be sure that the traces still existed and had not completely disappeared. Actually, I also have a way. At this moment, the middle-aged man sneered. As he spoke, supreme energy poured into his territory out of nowhere. It fused with the many spacetimes in his territory, causing the aura of the many spacetimes to rapidly expand. In the blink of an eye, it had already reached a level comparable to the spacetime controlled by Luo Fan and the world's will. However, this change did not cause the small dot above the residence of the world's will to change. The subtle trace that only left a sense of existence was still the same as before, as if nothing had happened. As expected, you've hidden your power there since a long time ago. Actually, the balance has already been broken by you. No wonder the construction of the karma is so slow. At this moment, Luo Fan sneered as he looked at the incarnation of the world's will nearby. There was only one reason why the balance did not change after the powerful energy was added, nor did it slow down the construction of the karma. It was because the energy had already been in the system since a long time ago. It had already been on the battlefield since a long time ago. This was the only way to explain it. As for why the energy had been hidden there since a long time ago, but the incarnation of the world's will did not show it, it was naturally because it had hidden it. This is my fault. However, there's no meaning in saying who's right or wrong now, right? The incarnation of the world's will smiled. His expression was incomparably firm, as if everything was under his control. This expression made people feel even more displeased. I see. No wonder I kept feeling that something was off. Back then, you really did betray me. You've been purposely putting me off all these years. The voice of the world's will rang out again. I already have my own self. Naturally, I'm completely different from before, the incarnation of the world's will said indifferently. Listening to their conversation, Luo Fan knew that what the world's will had said to him previously was not completely false. At the very least, the world's will believed that what he had said was true. At the very least, he truly believed that he had been deceiving Luo Fan along with the incarnation of the world's will from the beginning. However, he did not expect that he was the only one who truly believed this from the beginning. The former incarnation of the will of the world had already obtained its freedom from the very beginning. From the very beginning, it was no longer of the same mind as him. The world's will thought that there was no secret between him and the incarnation of the world's will, but in reality, he had been kept in the dark all this time. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan had an indescribable expression on his face as he quietly watched the exchange of words between the two sides. However, the world's will did not remain angry for too long. No matter what, it was still the world's will. Its ability to control its own emotions was not something that ordinary beings could compare to. Very soon, he regained his rationality. Since things have come to this, let's change our approach. At this moment, he made an indescribable suggestion. Change our approach? Luo Fan fell into thought. That's right, another approach. If we continue like this, there will be too many variables. It's too easy to flip the table. We need to change to a more stable and less likely method, the worlds will said indifferently. Hearing this, the incarnation of the worlds will suddenly sneered. You're not talking about betting the entire world on this, are you? If that's the case, your advantage will be too great. Even if we work together, we probably won't be able to resist you, right? The worlds will sneered. Is it my fault that you're weak and weak? Chapter 29:34. Luo Fan said indifferently, If you want it, I have no problem. He looked at the middle-aged man, who was the embodiment of the former world's will, with an indescribable expression. It wasn't that he thought the embodiment of the former world's will was childish, but he could tell that the embodiment of the former world's will seemed to want to make a bet between him and the world's will. What he said just now seemed to be refuting the world's will, but wasn't he also trying to provoke him, however? Even though he understood this, Luo Fan knew that this was actually the only way. As long as he wanted to truly establish the cause and effect, after all, the world's will's previous performance had already proved how many variables would appear if the battle dragged on. Who knew when one of the parties in the battle would have the idea of flipping the table and directly take action? Once that happened, the accumulation of all the battles they had fought previously would be completely for naught, and everything would have to start from scratch. In that case, even if they had unlimited time and wouldn't consume any of their energy due to the passage of time, they couldn't really spend all their time on such a task that was clearly far away. It wasn't just Luo Fan, the world's will was the same. As the two parties in the battle, the world's will could flip the table, and so could Luo Fan. Given the strength of the battlefield and the respective strengths of Luo Fan and the world's will, the world's will couldn't stop Luo Fan from flipping the table. Luo Fan was well aware of this, and so was the world's will. In reality, it was precisely because both of them had the strength to flip the table that they could establish a tacit understanding and establish the cause and effect together. Both of them had similar strengths, and both of them believed that they had absolute confidence in the matter, so they could truly cooperate as equals. If the world's will hadn't flipped the table before, they would naturally have believed that the other party would have some misgivings and wouldn't flip the table even if they failed. However, it was clear that the world's will had made a bad start. It had taken the initiative to flip the table, and this had swept away the tacit understanding they had established. Because of this, there was no longer any trust between them. Therefore, if they were unwilling to give up on this karmic construct, they could only use a method that neither of them could flip the table over. In other words, just like what the incarnation of the world's will had said, both sides would bet all their strength on this battle, and both sides would do their best to strengthen their side's strength in order to fight. It would be best if he could form the karma through a battle. This was not a simple matter. If they really wanted to do that, it wouldn't be something that could be achieved through the tacit understanding between them. If they really wanted to rely on a few victories in battles to truly establish the cause and effect, they would probably need to carry out a certain ceremony beforehand to complete the preliminary preparation of the cause and effect. It would be best if they could first construct the embryonic form of the cause and effect. At this moment, the will of the heaven and earth said indifferently, Since you are willing, then come. This tribulation has lasted for far, far too long. Luo Fan frowned slightly when he heard this. This tribulation was a tribulation to him, but it was a foundation for the will of the heaven and earth. Normally, as the will of the heaven and earth, It should have been extremely concerned about the existence of this great tribulation. It should have wanted to do its best to prolong the tribulation, and it would be best if it could make it permanent. However, at this moment, he could hear the will of the heaven and earth being annoyed by the will of the heaven and earth. It was as unbelievable as a person actually being tired of living. How could he not feel that something was wrong? Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat, and he turned to look at the middle-aged man beside him. At this moment, the middle-aged man had a subtle look of helplessness on his face, as if he had seen something that made him feel powerless and pained. That kind of situation shouldn't happen, right? At this moment, Luo Fan shook his head and slightly extinguished the thought that was popping up in his heart. However, to him, it did not matter how long the tribulation would last or how long it would last. After all, to him, any place was a place for cultivation. Regardless of whether he was in the tribulation or outside of it, whether he was in the true state of chaos or the simulated state of chaos, whether he was in the big world or the perfect world, or just on the path to sainthood that was opened by a true saint, it did not make a difference to him as long as he could cultivate. At this time, although he had stayed in this great calamity for an unimaginably long time, he could still cultivate and improve. Under such circumstances, he didn't feel that there was anything wrong with continuing this great tribulation. Of course, this was only for now. With his rate of improvement, this great tribulation would eventually become useless to him one day. The environment within it would eventually become useless to him one day. When that time came, he would naturally need to escape from this tribulation and break it. It was precisely because he had anticipated that the time would come that even though he felt that it did not matter to him to be in this great calamity and that he would still be cultivating here, he was also consciously searching for a way to break through this great calamity. Even if it was not urgent with Luo Fan's mentality, he was happy to see the worlds will work hard to end this tribulation. As for whether there was any secret behind this, and whether it was as unbelievable as the thought that he had just had, it did not matter. Therefore, at this moment, he directly dispelled all these thoughts. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and slapped the void. With just a single slap, countless strange lines, runes, and all sorts of strange patterns were born in the void. Under the control of his consciousness, they began to move unbelievably and inexplicably resonate with each other in the void. As they resonated, they gradually converged into one, turning into an extremely huge body that occupied an area of over 100 million light-years. After this body was formed, it began to tremble slightly and began to absorb all sorts of indescribable subtle auras from all directions, causing the emptiness within the body to gradually disappear at an unbelievable speed and become filled up. At this moment, an incomparably huge vortex appeared in the void out of nowhere. The vortex exuded an extremely obvious aura that belonged to the world's will. Obviously, it was the world's will. At the very least, it was the embodiment of the world's will. After the vortex appeared in the void, it began to churn rapidly. All sorts of indescribable subtle powers were constantly generated in the churning, turning into countless indescribable pillars of power that fell from the void and fiercely smashed into the huge body below, causing the emptiness within the body that was being rapidly filled up to be filled up at an even faster speed. Under these changes, the body seemed to have turned into a living creature. It was squirming rapidly, and all the details within began to swim at an unimaginable speed. The relationships between them were changing rapidly, and there seemed to be all sorts of subtle changes appearing within the structure of the body. It even gave off a vague feeling that the body seemed to have turned into a strange world. All the runes, all the lines, and all the strange patterns seemed to have become everything in the world, and even the living creatures within it. They began to carry out all sorts of extremely complicated activities within the huge body. At this moment, the embodiment of the world's will also made its move. In an instant, all sorts of indescribable powers were born in the void from all directions, and they began to continuously seep into the body, causing everything within the body to undergo a further evolution. The countless runes, lines, and shadows within it all became even more lively at this moment. Whether it was Luo Fan or the world's will, neither of them had any reaction to its actions, as if they had tacitly approved of its participation. Their efforts lasted for a total of 10 days and 10 nights. It must be known that back then, creating so many spacetimes was only a short period of time for them. Now, in order to construct such a body, they had worked with all their might for a total of 10 days and 10 nights. This was enough to show how extraordinary this body was. At this moment, after 10 days and 10 nights, this body had completely changed. It was now a pure and flawless body that no details could be discerned from it. This body looked like a void, like a world of its own, like a universe, like a self-sufficient existence that was completely unconnected to anything outside. At this moment, Luo Fan only indifferently said, "It's time to begin." The world's will also said, "That's right, it's indeed time to begin." Then, what are we waiting for? The middle-aged man, who was also the embodiment of the world's will, also spoke at this moment. As they spoke, countless strands of karma began to gather from all directions. In the eyes of ordinary living beings, every strand of karma was an incomparably huge river of karma. If any strand of karma entered a perfect world, it would probably be enough to distort the law of karma in that perfect world and cause chaos in the entire world. It might even trigger some sort of tribulation that affected the entire world. However, in this place, the karma that was like a river of karma in the eyes of ordinary people was only a strand of karma. At every moment, there were thousands of these strands of karma constantly fusing into that body. These were the various subtle karmic connections formed by the battle between Luo Fan, the world's will, and the embodiment of the world's will over the past million years. These karmic connections were originally about to gather into the outline of the war karma. However, because the world's will flipped the table, they collapsed once again and scattered across the world. It was only now that the three of them worked together that they began to gather again. They were about to form their original combination in this indescribable body, once again turning into the outline of the war karma. These karmic connections were extremely heavy and difficult to deal with. If this was an ordinary spacetime, a single strand of them would be enough to achieve the effect that Luo Fan and the world's will originally wanted, in other words, to truly link the territory and the outcome of the war together. However, in this world, or rather, in such a great calamity, let alone a single strand of such karma, even if there were tens of thousands of strands, or in other words, countless rivers of karma, they would only be able to form the outline of the war karma. Even the outline of the karma could not be truly formed. From this, it could be seen how difficult it was to truly form the karma that could restrict Luo Fan and the world's will in this world. At this moment, what Luo Fan and the others did was to rely on these karmic connections to forcefully deduce the structure of the war. They relied on this structure to actively absorb all resources to make up for the holes in these karmic connections. After that, when these holes were completely filled up, the war karma would naturally be completely formed. Of course, during this process, it was impossible for all three of them to be obedient. Each of them worked hard to leave behind a backup plan that was beneficial to them in the structure of the karma, and then worked hard to eliminate the other's backup plan. Through this method, they worked hard to make the karma lean towards them after it was formed. As for which side the karma would lean towards after it was formed, it would depend on how brilliant their methods were. All three of them were well aware of this, so they tacitly agreed to this method. Even the embodiment of the former worlds will no longer felt that this was unfair. Done. On this day, Luo Fan suddenly shouted. With this shout, an extremely powerful force erupted from the entire body. An endless suction force was born from it, acting on the void space within a range of trillions of light years. Immediately after, the suction force disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. Faced with this change, the rotation of the vortex in the void seemed to change slightly, as if it was extremely restless. Chapter 29:38. At this moment, Luo Fan deeply furrowed his brows. This was a rather troublesome situation for him. Those world founders were not ordinary existences. They were existences that could create worlds in the simulated state of chaos. No matter how weak such existences were, they were definitely at the level of tribulation cultivators. Moreover, compared to those naturally born tribulation cultivators, they were much stronger in terms of understanding, support, and control of the world. With the addition of those world founders, there would definitely be an unbelievable leap in all aspects of those worlds. It could be said that with just this move, the many worlds in the territories of the world founders had completely caught up to Luo Fan and even surpassed him by a lot. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but turn his attention to the world founders under his control. Of course, he quickly dispelled this thought. Only the world's wills could use the world founders in such an important battle. Even the previous incarnations of the world's wills were inferior in comparison. For Luo Fan, it was even more impossible for him to use them. After all, the birth of the world founders was due to the need for so many world founders to simulate the primal chaos. The purpose of the simulated state of chaos was obviously to be Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. Under such circumstances, it could be said that the world founders were born with the purpose of being a part of Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. In this way, it could be said that the world founders were born with the purpose of being a part of Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. Under such circumstances, if some existences who knew the truth revealed the purpose of the world founders' birth to the world founders, the consequences would be absolutely unpredictable. There would definitely be many world founders who would choose to turn hostile and attack Luo Fan instead. Even if some of the pioneers were more rational and did not attack him, it was impossible for them to continue helping him wholeheartedly like they did in the past. In this way, sending the world creators into their own territories and letting them control those worlds was equivalent to tying a ticking time bomb to their own world. Moreover, the remote control for this time bomb was in the hands of the world founders. Under such circumstances, unless Luo Fan wanted to commit suicide, there was no way he could let the world founders control the worlds in their territories. Since he could not directly let the world founders enter their own worlds to suppress them, he could only choose another method to help those worlds. After all, ignoring everything was equivalent to handing over victory with both hands. If he wanted to win, he naturally had to find a way to resolve the current disadvantage as much as possible. It was extremely difficult for the Supreme Emperors to grow into tribulation powerhouses, and without tribulation powerhouses to suppress them, it was impossible for the world to be stable. Therefore, the only way to resolve the current problem was to transmit the inheritance that the Supreme Emperors needed to break through to the worlds. At this moment, Luo Fan made up his mind. With a slight thought, his clones directly entered those worlds and began to preach the method of tribulations to the many worlds. The method of tribulation was not something that could be explained in a few words. Normally, it would take tens of millions of years of guidance for a Supreme Emperor to completely comprehend the method of tribulation. It could be said that although it was called a certain method, it was more like a form of assimilation and infection. Without the guidance of those tens of millions of years, even if he condensed all the techniques, words, and actions he had taught over the tens of millions of years and told them to the Supreme Emperor, it would still be impossible for him to make a breakthrough. Because of this, Luo Fan needed to send clones into those worlds. Fortunately, it was not difficult for him to create hundreds of millions of clones, especially when those worlds were still under his absolute control. It was even easier for him to create so many clones that were enough to completely suppress the Supreme Emperors. After those clones entered those worlds, they used various methods to summon the Supreme Emperors who might break through. After time and space transformed into a world, the supreme level of cultivators rose to the Supreme Emperor level. The false sage stage was already considered the highest level in time and space, but there were also limited positions. However, there was no longer any limit to the number of false sages. The cultivators who could not break through and become false sages because they did not have a position began to become false sages. After the world transformed into a world, the high level of cultivators rose to the level of tribulation powerhouses. At this time, similarly, the position of the Supreme Emperor, which was originally the highest level and had a limited position, was also released. The despair cultivators who could not break through because they did not have a position began to break through like a blowout. Under such circumstances, although there were still no true tribulation powerhouses in those worlds, the number of Supreme Emperors had unknowingly increased by thousands of times. Now, the number of Supreme Emperors that were summoned by Luo Fan's clone from all over the world could be considered a grand sight. Luo Fan naturally knew the situation inside these worlds. At this time, he was not surprised by the number of Supreme Emperors at all. Seeing that many Supreme Emperors who hoped to become tribulation powerhouses had appeared here, he no longer stood on ceremony. He forcibly used his supreme power to suppress those Supreme Emperors, letting them clearly feel how big the gap between them was. Just this action was enough to make them become obedient. After all the Supreme Emperors became obedient, Luo Fan's clone no longer hesitated and began to explain to them. The independence of the world was greater than that of the world, and the difference between the flow of time inside and the flow of time outside could be greater. Although the situation outside was already quite critical, and the world's will could launch a great battle at any time, there was still enough time for the Supreme Emperors to break through in those worlds. According to Luo Fan's estimation, even if the worlds will launched a great battle now, when the war really reached a point where those Supreme Emperors had no choice but to give up their seclusion and start fighting, the time inside those worlds could still be extended to trillions of years. Such a time was already enough for Luo Fan to make use of to nurture a large number of tribulation powerhouses. The atmosphere in this territory that belonged to Luo Fan was quiet. Compared to the peace here, the situation in the other two worlds was obviously not so peaceful. Compared to Luo Fan's clone that directly entered those worlds to help the tribulation powerhouses that were born, the protection of the former world's will was not as convenient. It must be known that the clone of the former world's will was still hiding somewhere. He didn't dare to enter the world with his incarnation at this moment. If he dared to do that, then the will of the heavens and the earth would absolutely not hesitate to deduce the location of his true body based on his clone, and then descend upon his true body with supreme might to annihilate his true body. The clone of the former world's will was very clear about this. As for descending with his clone without affecting his true body, it was impossible for the clone of the former world's will to do that. After all, the connection between the embodiment and the original body was an extremely peculiar one. If this connection was severed, then the embodiment would become completely independent and become an independent entity. In that case, the clone would become a completely new individual and would no longer be his clone. Obviously, this went against the original purpose of the clone of the former world's will. As long as this connection was maintained, this incarnation would still be his incarnation. However, the connection between this incarnation and his original body was like an obvious guide. No matter how well hidden his original body was, existences with sharp senses could easily capture his original body through this incarnation. With this kind of restriction, it was obviously impossible for the former incarnation of the will of the world to be like Luo Fan, who directly threw his incarnation into those worlds to nurture the cultivators within them, allowing them to give birth to tribulation realm experts. Even though the clone of the former world's will could not use this method, it did not give up. Instead, it took another path and directly sent all kinds of inheritances into those worlds. It used mysterious techniques to communicate with the many worlds and fuse them into a single entity, instantly expanding the world in the eyes of all living beings in those worlds. Through these various actions, the supreme emperors in those worlds were stimulated countless times more than they had been in the past countless years, be it in terms of their minds or power. Through this kind of stimulation, combined with the various inheritances that had been inserted into the heavens and earth, the supreme emperors had more hope of breaking through than before. This method was also a way to create tribulation powerhouses. Compared to Luo Fan directly sending his clone into those worlds to guide the supreme emperors to break through, the efficiency was much lower. However, at the very least, compared to letting the supreme emperors search for a way to break through in confusion, the efficiency was much, much higher. Perhaps in the eyes of ordinary mortals, using a mysterious technique to communicate with the many worlds would still be peaceful, and the territories would still be as stable as before. However, anyone with the slightest perception would know that at this moment, the territories of the former worlds were in a state of turmoil. The conflict between the circulation of auras, the conflict between the wills of living beings, and the conflict between the foundations of the world had caused an earth-shattering commotion beyond the line of sight of the mortals. It caused the territory to be like a barrel filled with gunpowder, giving off the illusion that it would explode in the next moment. In order to give birth to tribulation powerhouses, the territories of the former worlds were no longer peaceful. However, in the territories of the former worlds those worlds were not peaceful at all. Those worlds were nurtured bit by the world's will from time and space. Although they were already worlds, it was obvious that they did not have many special characteristics. If the tribulation powerhouses in those worlds were born naturally, they would naturally be very compatible with the world, and the current situation of those worlds would naturally make the tribulation powerhouses extremely satisfied. However, it was clear that the experts who had entered the tribulation in those worlds were not naturally born from those worlds. Those tribulation powerhouses were formed by the world's will, which was directly sent into those worlds by the world's will. Under such circumstances, the worlds that did not have many special characteristics were obviously very uncomfortable for the world's founders, and they were very dissatisfied with everything. Evidently, these world creators did not enter those worlds to be hired thugs of those worlds. The reason they entered those worlds was to become the controllers, guides, and suppressors of the world. Since that was the case, the world was not compatible with them, so they naturally could not adapt to the world. Instead, the world had to adapt to them. Therefore, after discovering that there were too many things that were not to their liking in the worlds that they had entered, the world's founders chose to directly transform those worlds. They transformed the laws, structures, energy, matter, and even the frequency of time and space that were not compatible with them. Under such transformation, those worlds naturally could not be as peaceful as before. Almost all the worlds were undergoing this transformation, producing all sorts of inexplicable changes. It was as if some kind of plasticine was being casually kneaded by an invisible hand. Occasionally, some kind of huge explosion would appear in those worlds, causing them to undergo some sort of big or small change in those worlds. With so many worlds undergoing such changes, how could the territory that belonged to the world's will still be peaceful? At this time, the territories of the three parties were extremely strange. They still maintained their original state of non-interference. This gave Luo Fan more time to nurture the many cultivators in his territory, so that they would have a greater chance of becoming tribulation powerhouses before the real battle broke out. Under this state of non-interference between the three parties, time gradually passed. Unknowingly, 100 years had passed. Chapter 2939. The billions of trillion years were a long period of time for the living beings in the world, but for Luo Fan, the world's will, and the former incarnation of the world's will, it was only a slightly longer period of time. Even if they devoted themselves to these worlds, they wouldn't leave any traces of time because of the passage of billions of trillions of years. What's more, during this period of time, only Luo Fan's incarnation had entered the world. His real body was still outside the world, so he was naturally less affected. The impact of this long period of time on the world's will was also quite obvious. In the territory of the world's will, such a long period of time had already caused the world to completely change. Under the modification of the many world founders, the world had already completely adapted to them. Now, there didn't seem to be many traces left in the world when it was first formed. Looking at it now, those worlds looked more like the worlds created by the creators of the world. It was so much so that one could even find traces of the worldview that belonged to the world founders, and these traces had even changed the nature of the world. As for the power of the world, it was constantly rising during this process. Now, apart from the world founders, the number of tribulation stage powerhouses in the world was already full. In other words, the number of tribulation stage powerhouses in the world was the same as the number of tribulation stage powerhouses that the world could withstand. These tribulation stage powerhouses occupied their respective positions, using their own power to suppress and nourish the world. Because all the tribulation stage powerhouses had returned to their positions, the world was many times more stable than before. Moreover, because the nature of the world had been changed, these tribulation stage powerhouses' worldview had unknowingly been distorted over the long period of time. Now, they had already completely complied with the worldview of the world founders and recognized that worldview as the true worldview in the depths of their hearts. Under such a change, their ego had already unknowingly become distorted in a subtle way. However, it was clear that this distortion was only meaningful to them. For everything in the outside world, this distortion was meaningless perhaps to them. The distorted selves were no longer the original selves. This kind of distortion was equivalent to killing the original self. It could be said to be a kind of irreconcilable hatred. However, to the outside world, what was the difference between the tribulation realm expert before the distortion and the one after the distortion? For the outside world, as long as it was a tribulation realm expert, it was enough. As for whether that self was the original self or the new self, it didn't matter at all. After all the tribulation cultivators in the world returned to their positions, the instability of the foundation of the world had completely disappeared, and the world's ability to withstand cultivators had greatly increased. Due to this, the rate at which the cultivators of the world grew increasingly faster. Originally, the world could withstand an unlimited number of supreme emperors, despaired ones, and false saints. However, because not all the tribulation experts had returned, it was difficult for the world's potential to be fully unleashed. If a cultivator wanted to cultivate to a higher realm, although there were no shackles that made people despair, the world would still not be able to support them. In this way, cultivators would not be able to obtain much help from the world when cultivating, and their cultivation speed would naturally not be very fast. However, now that the situation had changed, the world's attitude towards the growth of cultivators was completely different. That kind of strong support was enough to weaken the bottleneck of a cultivator's breakthrough, and it was enough to reduce the difficulty of a cultivator's improvement. In this way, the number of cultivators could naturally be expected to increase. At this moment, in terms of the quality of cultivators, the world was at least tens of thousands of times stronger than before. Not to mention, in terms of quantity, the world's will was far superior to before. It could be said that in just a short 100 years in the outside world, the power within the territory of the world's will had increased by hundreds of thousands of times. If the world's will's territory was like this, the situation in the former world's will's territory was not much different. Although it didn't directly send the creator of the world into the world, it could easily make tribulation cultivators appear in the world's territories. However, the incarnation of the former world's will had sent its inheritance into the world, expanding the horizons of all living beings in the world, and increasing the communication between them was also very effective. After so many years of development, the tribulation cultivators in the world had also been born. Although the quality of the tribulation cultivators was much lower than the creator of the world, they were born from the clashes between many supreme emperors. Therefore, the number of cultivators that had a chance of breaking through and becoming tribulation cultivators was many times higher than the number of cultivators in the world's will's territory. It could be said that if it wasn't for the world's restriction on the number of tribulation cultivators, the number of tribulation cultivators in the world would have definitely increased by several times. However, even so, the cultivators that had a chance of breaking through and becoming tribulation cultivators were far stronger than ordinary supreme emperors. If a peak monarch realm existence were to encounter such an expert, then that peak monarch realm existence would probably not be able to withstand a single strike or even a single gaze from him. It could be said that such existences could be called half-step tribulation cultivators. In the eyes of supreme emperors, these half-step tribulation cultivators were no different from true tribulation cultivators. In the eyes of true tribulation cultivators, they were no different from supreme emperors. This situation could be said to be quite awkward. However, this awkward situation made them unimaginably useful in the war. As long as they avoided the tribulation cultivators, they were almost invincible. In this case, as long as there were tribulation cultivators holding back the creator of the world's will's territory, the other battlefields would no longer pose any threat to them. It could be said that success and victory were only a matter of time. This situation made the territory of the former worlds will not be at an absolute disadvantage against the territory of the world's will. In the comparison of supreme cultivators, the territory of the former world's will was at a disadvantage. However, in the case of other forces, the territory of the former world's will was at an absolute advantage. In this way, although the advantages and disadvantages could not be directly neutralized, they would still affect each other in the end. In the end, the two sides were barely on par. Unlike the development of the other two sides, in Luo Fan's territory, there were his incarnations guiding all living beings in the world. The speed at which the cultivators inside improved was much faster than the speed at which the cultivators inside the avatar of the will of the world improved. At the same time, in the territory of the former world's will, there were only newly born tribulation cultivators. On the other hand, in Luo Fan's territory, many of the supreme emperors had not only become tribulation realm powerhouses, but they had also taken a big step forward in the tribulation realm. Currently, in the many worlds in Luo Fan's territory, the number of tribulation cultivators had reached the limit that the world could bear. Moreover, the level of these tribulation cultivators was not low. Most of them had surpassed the second tribulation, and some had even surpassed the third or fourth tribulation. Such strength was not much weaker than even those who had opened up the world. It must be said that although the world's creators were famous and had terrifying titles, they were still cultivators created by Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. No matter what, it was impossible for his cultivation to surpass Luo Fan's. In other words, it was impossible for them to surpass the seventh tribulation cultivator level. As a result, most of the world's creators' cultivation realms were only at the third or fourth tribulation level. The fifth tribulation could already be considered to surpass most people. The sixth tribulation could already be considered a peak expert. As for the seventh tribulation, it was the peak above the peak, and they were strong competitors for the perfect world's creators. Under such circumstances, the world's creators that were sent into the many worlds in the territory of the former worlds will only had an average cultivation realm of the fourth or fifth tribulation. Compared to Luo Fan's territory, where the average level of tribulation cultivators was at the second or third tribulation, they were indeed much stronger. However, compared to the average level of tribulation cultivators at the first or second tribulation in the territory of the former world's will, they were much stronger. Moreover, because of the guidance of Luo Fan's speech, the overall strength of the cultivators in his territory could be said to have improved. However, it was not just a few supreme emperors that broke through and became tribulation cultivators. Instead, there were too many supreme emperors that really came into contact with the threshold of tribulation. If it were not for the fact that the world's tolerance for tribulation cultivators was limited, and the number of tribulation cultivators that could be born in the world was limited, perhaps the number of tribulation cultivators in each world would have multiplied by several times. After all, the strongest tribulation cultivators could make great strides in the tribulation realm with Luo Fan's guidance. Even if the other cultivators who received guidance from Luo Fan gained less, they would still have gained something. These supreme emperors that could not become tribulation cultivators due to the restrictions of the world could also be called half-step tribulation cultivators. Such a powerhouse was an invincible existence in the eyes of the supreme emperors. However, to the real tribulation cultivators, they were absolute weaklings. In this way, their existence also made the power below the tribulation cultivator level in Luo Fan's territory far superior to that of the former world's will. The situation in Luo Fan's territory was similar to the situation in the former world's will's territory. However, the power in Luo Fan's territory was superior to that of the former world's will's territory in all aspects. It could be said that if the will of the heavens and earth did not participate or pay attention to it, just the power in Luo Fan's own territory would be enough to completely annihilate the territory of the former will of the heavens and earth, completely eliminating the incarnation of the former will of the heavens and earth. Of course, Luo Fan obviously would not make such a choice. If he took the initiative to eliminate the former world's will's incarnation, he would lose a lot of power in the process. If he did that, he would have to face the world's will's territory alone. Obviously, even the low-level power could easily suppress the low-level power in the world's will's territory. However, in terms of the high-level power, his territory was still at a disadvantage. If they really fought like that, although there was some suspense about the outcome, it was still more likely that he would lose. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan chose to attack the former world's will's incarnation first, he would obviously be courting death. In comparison, if he cooperated with the former world's will's incarnation, the situation would be completely different. Although the high-level power in the world's will's territory would be stronger than any of the high-level power in Luo Fan's territory and the former world's will's territory alone. However, if Luo Fan and the former world's will's territory truly joined forces, they would definitely be on par in terms of high-level power. Once this happened, it would be enough for Luo Fan and the former world's will's territory to achieve complete victory. After all, if the high-level power was in a stalemate, the low-level power would have an absolute advantage. In that case, as long as the high-level power held the opponent back, the low-level power would quickly eliminate the opponent's low-level power, and then converge with the high-level power to attack the opponent's high-level power. Victory would be certain. Even if they had to pay a huge price, in other words, if Luo Fan and the former world's will's incarnation worked together, then both sides would definitely win. However, it was clear that it was impossible for them to cooperate with each other. After all, Luo Fan's territory was superior to the former world's will's territory in all aspects. If the world's will did not act as a third party to restrain Luo Fan, the former world's will would not be able to stop Luo Fan's territory at all. Therefore, the former worlds will definitely not allow such a situation to happen. If it cooperated with Luo Fan to eliminate the world's will, wouldn't it create such a situation?